The crystal chandelier above table 12 began to tremble, not from an earthquake, not from the music, but from the howl of a 71-year-old man screaming the name of a daughter who had been dead for 22 years. Arthur Rourke, the former kingpin who once made all of Chicago kneel, was now slamming his fist onto a white linen tablecloth, and the classic champagne flutes burst and shattered across the marble floor like fireworks at a funeral. His hands, the same hands that used to sign death sentences without a courtroom, were now clawing at the air, searching for a silhouette only he could see. He shouted in a voice gone raw and gravelly, repeating a single name again and again. Brianna, Brianna, like a prayer from a man who'd lost his mind but never lost his pain. Around him, the Meridian, the pinnacle of Chicago's upper-class luxury, had frozen solid. Silver forks hovered midair. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. Faces had gone pale, yet no one dared move. It wasn't because of the old man. It was because of the person sitting right beside him. Beckett Rourke, 37 years old, the only son, the heir to an empire his father built in blood, a name whispered at the Chicago docks and in locked boardrooms on the 40th floor, never spoken aloud. He sat there with his jaw clenched so hard, the bone at his temple bulged beneath the skin, one hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles blanched, his whole body giving off a cold, lethal pressure that made even the 3 bodyguards behind him refuse to step forward. Beckett Rourke could give a single order, and this entire floor of the restaurant would vanish before dawn. But tonight, in front of his father, he was completely, absolutely powerless. Arthur snatched up a porcelain plate rimmed in gold, his face twisted by a grief that didn't belong to the present, and hurled it straight into the glass wall. It exploded into 1,000 white star fragments, and the sound of that breaking rang through the silent room like the snap of bone. Beckett didn't flinch, but his eyes closed, for exactly a fraction of a second. And in that brief instant, all the power, all the money, all the fear he'd sown across the city, all of it became meaningless. He remembered the last time his father was still lucid, 3 years earlier, when Arthur had looked at him and said, "You look like Brianna when you smile. Don't ever stop smiling." Beckett hadn't smiled since then. He'd forgotten how to. The staff retreated deeper into the shadows. The manager, Gerald, stood 10 steps away, trembling like a leaf. The upper class swallowed hard and didn't dare breathe too loudly. No one came close, because getting close to Arthur was an insult to Beckett, and insulting Beckett didn't come with a second chance. He was a king of a dark kingdom. Yet tonight, in the middle of the most glamorous 5-star restaurant in Chicago, that king was drowning, anchored to a man who'd forgotten his son's name, but remembered every drop of sorrow from an entire lifetime. And no one in this world imagined that, just minutes from now, a thin 27-year-old waitress, with dark circles under her eyes from too little sleep and calluses on her hands from washing dishes, would step out from behind the kitchen door and change everything. If this story touched you, please hit like to support healing stories like this one. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right time can save a soul. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you won't miss the next stories, where light is always found in the darkest places. The kitchen door flew open, and she stepped out. No one noticed her right away, because in that moment every pair of eyes in the Meridian was pinned to the old man screaming at table 12. But the light noticed her. Candlelight from the silver candelabras caught the white of her dress first, then the vivid red apron tied at her waist, the only living color left in a darkness that was tightening its grip on the room. Maeve Holloway, 27 years old, hired less than 2 weeks ago, looked almost translucent from sleeplessness. Her copper-brown hair pulled neat at the nape, her deep-set eyes ringed with shadows that sat there like old bruises. She stood behind the velvet curtain for 3 seconds before she stepped out. And in those 3 seconds, she didn't think about compassion, she didn't think about courage, and she didn't think about anything noble, the kind of thing people like to attach to extraordinary acts. She thought about room 14B. Arthur Rourke's howl yanked her straight back to the Illinois State Psychiatric Hospital, the 3rd floor, a corridor reeking of disinfectant and old tears, where her mother used to curl on an iron bed and scream exactly like that, screaming for names that weren't there, screaming until her voice turned into a dry, torn whisper. And no nurse came into the room because the shift was over, because the budget had been cut, because she was only one patient among hundreds the world had decided to forget. Maeve stepped out not because she was an angel. She stepped out because that scream was her mother's scream, and she was angry. Angry at this glittering room, at dozens of wealthy, powerful people, each one of them able to pay her mother's hospital bills for a lifetime, yet sitting frozen, silver forks suspended, faces drained of color, no one moving, the same way the world had stood and watched her mother die without doing a thing. And at the same time, in a darker corner of her mind, a practical voice, cold and utterly unromantic, whispered that Gerald would fire her if she did nothing, that the rent was 2 months late, and that if she handled this, maybe, just maybe, she'd keep her job. She hated herself for that voice, but the truth was still the truth, no matter how ugly it was. She crossed the service area, past manager Gerald as he frantically motioned for her to go back. She didn't look at him, and she walked straight into the war zone. A bodyguard stepped into her path. His chest was a wall of black wool, his shoulders twice her width, his hand already sliding toward the holster beneath his tailored jacket. Maeve didn't stop. She lifted her gaze to his, and her eyes weren't defiant. They were something that made a man 3 times her size hesitate. A quiet, absolute certainty that belonged to someone who'd been through this terrain before, who'd stood in front of violence, who'd been knocked down and stood back up, who'd looked death in the eye and didn't blink. He moved back half a step, and Maeve walked through. Beckett saw her then. His eyes, sharp lines sweeping the room with a predator's vigilance, stopped on her. He saw a thin girl, pale and worn, dark circles under her eyes, dishwashing calluses on her hands, dressed as a server, walking into the heart of the storm that even the bodyguards paid thousands of dollars a night wouldn't step into. Irritation rose first, the territorial reflex, the refusal to add another witness to his father's unraveling, the refusal to let anyone see the crack in the fortress he'd built over 22 years. But braided into that irritation was something he couldn't name, like looking into a mirror and finding a different version of himself. A version without weapons, without an empire, without armor, nothing left but deep eyes carrying the same extinguished light he used to see in the mirror every morning. Then Maeve did what no one in that room expected. She didn't offer a towel. She didn't apologize. She didn't bend to pick up the glass. She didn't suggest a private room. She knelt, right there on the restaurant floor, among the shattered crystal glittering like fallen stars, among the pool of Bordeaux spreading like blood across white marble. Maeve Holloway slowly lowered her knees to the ground. The entire room stopped breathing. The bodyguards jolted. Gerald stood rigid, his mouth open, no sound coming out. She didn't lower herself out of fear. She lowered herself beneath Arthur, beneath his pain, a posture that was both the deepest humility and the greatest strength, a strength no one in that room, not even Beckett Rourke with his underground empire and the army under his command, could reach. She placed her left hand on the edge of Arthur's chair, gently, only inches from the fingers still clawing at the air. She didn't touch him. She was simply there, as if she were telling him, in a wordless language, that she wouldn't take hold of him, she wouldn't pull him, she wouldn't force him back. She would only stay, and he could choose to return when he was ready. The stillness Maeve carried as she knelt began to spread like mist, softening the sharp edges of Arthur's psychotic storm. His bellowing didn't stop outright, but it ebbed, like a fire running out of fuel, shifting from a scream that tore the air into broken sobs, then into a low, trembling moan. His hands still flailed, but slower now, weaker, as if the quiet presence of the girl kneeling at his feet had anchored him, even if only by a fragile thread. Maeve didn't look at him. She looked around, slowly, her deep, fathomless eyes sweeping over the wrecked room, over the crystal shards on the floor, over the pale faces frozen at distant tables, over the candles that kept burning, indifferent, on silver holders, and her gaze stopped in the corner. There, half hidden behind a heavy curtain, a grand piano lay silent like a sleek black animal asleep. Its lid was open, the white and black keys catching candlelight, the velvet bench empty. The pianist, the man hired to play background music for an upper-class dinner, had fled long ago. Maybe the first moment Arthur erupted, maybe even before the first champagne glass burst on the floor. Maeve rose. Her knees were wet with wine. A few tiny bits of glass clung to the fabric of her dress, but she didn't brush them off. She walked straight toward the piano, her steps silent on the velvet carpet, one step, then another, as if she were moving through her own dream, and not through a 5-star restaurant sinking into chaos. Gerald, the manager, murmured something she didn't hear. A security guard shifted to block her, but Beckett lifted his hand, a small gesture, his index finger rising and falling, and the guard froze like stone. Beckett didn't know why he stopped them. He didn't know why he let this girl keep walking, keep existing in a space that should have held only him and his father, and their darkness. But he let her go, and she sat down at the piano. Everyone still in the room, anyone who hadn't run or didn't dare to run, thought she was insane. They thought the new waitress, not even 2 weeks on the job, had completely lost her mind, that she was about to make everything worse, that the sound of the piano would trigger another frenzy in the old man, that Beckett Rourke would fire his gun right there at the dinner table. But Maeve didn't think about them. She set her fingers on the keys, and in the instant skin touched ivory, she was no longer at the Meridian. She was in the small kitchen on the 3rd floor of a cheap apartment building on the south side of Chicago, the smell of frying grease and laundry detergent in the air, 8 years old, sitting on her mother's lap, and her mother was singing. The first melody rose slowly, so simple it was almost childish, only a few notes repeating. Low then high, high then low, like breath, like a heartbeat, like a lullaby with no words, only the pure sound of a mother holding her child before the world stole her away. Maeve's technique was rough. Her left hand stumbled at the octave. The rhythm wasn't perfect, and there were places she pressed too hard, making a note ring sharp instead of soft. She hadn't been trained properly. She'd learned piano from a volunteer at a shelter when she was 15, on an old electronic keyboard, missing 3 keys, and the only song she knew by heart was this one, the melody her mother used to sing every night before she began singing for people who weren't there. But the feeling inside each note couldn't be faked. It was real enough to hurt, real enough to feel stripped bare, real enough that anyone with a heart still beating in their chest had to understand the person playing this wasn't performing. She was bleeding through the keys. Maeve's tears began to fall on the 12th note. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't open her eyes. The drops slid down her cheeks, fell onto her wrist, fell onto the white keys, and her hands didn't stop. She wasn't playing for Arthur. She was playing for her mother, for room 14B that she'd reached 20 minutes too late, for the white sheet that had been pulled over her mother's face before she could see her one last time, for the 16-year-old girl standing in a hospital hallway, arms hanging limp, mouth open, unable to cry because the pain was bigger than tears. She played for all of it, and the piano inside the Meridian wasn't dinner music. It was a prayer for the dead. And then the thing no one dared to hope happened. Arthur stopped, completely. His hands dropped, no longer flailing, no longer striking, just lying still on his thighs. His head tilted to one side, slowly, like a bird listening to a sound coming from very far away. His eyes, bloodshot and cloudy, still wet, weren't staring into nothing anymore. They were turned toward the piano. He stood up, trembling, nearly falling when his knees refused to obey. Tate, the guard, stepped forward on instinct, but Beckett had already half risen, his whole body taut as a drawn bow, eyes locked on his father, hands ready to catch him but not touching yet. Arthur didn't need anyone to hold him. He walked toward the piano, step by heavy step, dragging across the velvet carpet. And when he reached it, he pulled the empty chair beside Maeve, sat down, and laid both hands on the glossy black wooden lid, and he cried. Not a bellow, not a shout. Silent tears, one drop, then another, slid down his wrinkled face, fell onto the piano lid, and gathered into small pools that reflected candlelight. These were the tears of a man remembering something, something he'd buried deep, something the illness had buried deeper. But music had just dug up again. Beckett stood 5 steps away, and he understood. Brianna had studied piano. His sister, the 8-year-old who died 22 years ago in the Red Lily Garden, had once sat on the velvet bench at home, her tiny hands tapping out clumsy notes, off rhythm, wrong intervals, just like the notes Maeve was playing now. His father wasn't hearing a stranger. His father was hearing Brianna. Beckett swallowed, his throat aching as if he were swallowing glass. He looked at Maeve, truly looked, for the second time tonight, but this time deeper, and he saw the silver scar running along the side of her neck, thin and long, catching the candlelight like a strand of silver someone had stitched into skin. He saw her eyes shut, lashes trembling, tears sliding over sharp cheekbones, and her calloused hands still pressing each key with the careful steadiness of someone trying to keep something from shattering. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't an expert. She was a wounded healer, someone who'd walked through her own fire and learned to recognize the smell of smoke in others. And tonight, in the Meridian, among shattered crystal and spilled wine, she used that fire to strike a single small match, just enough for Arthur Rourke to find his way home, even if only for a few minutes. The final note faded the way a candle dies when the wick is gone, the sound not disappearing abruptly but dissolving slowly into the air, seeping into the walls, into the ceiling, into the velvet carpet, into every shard of crystal still scattered across the marble floor, still glittering there. And when it was gone completely, the silence that crashed down wasn't peace. It was heavy, so heavy that Maeve felt it pressing on her shoulders, on her chest, along every segment of her spine. The Meridian became a cathedral without a pastor, holding only 2 people at the piano, one old and one young, both crying for those who were no longer alive. Maeve opened her eyes, slowly, her lashes weighted with tears. She turned to look at Arthur. The old man sat motionless, both hands still laid flat on the piano lid, eyes closed, tears soaking down his cheeks into the collar of his white shirt, and his lips were moving, not screaming, not shouting. He was murmuring, so softly that only Maeve, seated less than a hand's breadth from him, could hear it. At first she thought it was breath, then she caught it more clearly, word by broken word, repeated over and over like a chant, like a prayer, like a drowning man clinging to the last piece of wood floating in the sea. Lily, the garden. Brianna, the red lily, the garden. He repeated it, and repeated it, and repeated it again, each time a little quieter, each time his eyes squeezed a little tighter, as if he were sinking deeper into a place no one could pull him back from. Maeve listened. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't call his name. She only sat there and listened. 2 years of volunteering at the Illinois State Psychiatric Hospital had taught her things no university ever could. She'd sat beside the beds of hundreds of patients, heard thousands of murmurs that sounded meaningless to outsiders but were full of meaning to the one speaking, and she'd learned that people with dementia didn't speak at random. They didn't ramble in chaotic confusion. Their minds got stuck, like an old record with the needle dropped into the same groove, looping the same passage again and again. And that passage was always the strongest memory, the most painful memory, the moment that split their life into 2 halves that never fit back together. Her mother had repeated the same way. Room 14B, 2 a.m. Her mother sitting on an iron bed, eyes wide open at the wall, murmuring her father's name, murmuring the name of their old house, murmuring the name of a lullaby, looping it until her voice wore down into a thin, scraped whisper. And Maeve knew her mother wasn't speaking to her. Her mother was reliving the happiest moment of her life, the moment before everything collapsed, because her mind had chosen to stay there instead of facing a reality too painful to survive. Arthur was the same. He wasn't muttering nonsense. He was inside a memory. He was standing in a garden, where red lilies grew, where there was a child named Brianna, and something horrifying had happened there, something that broke him, and he had never left that garden, not even if his body sat here, in a 5-star restaurant, in a $10,000 suit. Maeve drew in a slow breath. She turned toward Beckett, standing 5 steps away, his tall body locked rigid as stone, eyes fixed on his father, jaw clenched, his whole presence humming with the energy of a bomb counting down. She spoke softly, only loud enough for him to hear, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering out of control. He isn't here. Beckett didn't react, or, rather, his reaction was absolute stillness, the stillness of a predator just before the strike. Maeve went on, her voice still gentle, still even, as though she were speaking to a wild animal that could bite at any second. He's going back to the garden, the place where red lilies grow. He's looking for someone there, someone who never came back. Time froze. Beckett went numb, not the cold composure he always wore, but the numbness of someone who's just been stabbed and didn't even see the blade. His eyes widened for exactly a fraction of a second, then narrowed again at once, survival instinct dragging the armor back into place. But Maeve had seen it. She'd seen that moment, the moment when, inside the fortress, a door that had been sealed for 22 years suddenly shuttered. That secret, the garden of red lilies, the little girl, the death, the tragedy buried under layers of erased police reports, bought witnesses, sealed court files, 22 years of silence purchased with money and fear, a story no one in Chicago knew. And yet a waitress who'd worked here less than 2 weeks had just spoken it out loud, right here in the wrecked restaurant, in a voice as calm as a bedtime story. Beckett's hand slid inside his suit jacket, slow, deliberate, his fingers finding cold steel. And when he spoke, his voice carried a danger thicker than gunfire. "How do you know?" 2 words, not a question, a verdict, a final warning before death knocked on the door. Anyone else would have shaken, stepped back, stammered out an explanation. Maeve looked straight into his eyes. Her gaze didn't challenge him, didn't plead, didn't fear him. It was clear, like a lake at dawn, and so deep that Beckett felt as if he were staring down a bottomless well. "Because I heard him say it," she answered, level. Everyone else heard the screaming, but I heard the words. He kept repeating Lily, the garden, Brianna. That isn't delirium. It's a memory loop. I've sat beside people like him for 2 years. I know when someone is lost, and when someone is remembering. She paused for a single breath. And when she continued, her voice changed. No longer the voice of rational explanation, but softer, lower, carrying the weight of a lifetime. And because I've lived my whole life in that garden, I know the smell of earth when it swallows what you love. The words were for Arthur and for herself, and their weight fell across the room like a stone dropped into still water. Beckett didn't speak. His hand was still inside his jacket, but his fingers had released the cold steel at some point without him noticing. He stared at her, and for the first time in 22 years, he felt something other than anger and control, something soft and dangerous, like a crack in a dam that would sweep everything away if he wasn't careful. And while the two of them held each other's gaze across 5 steps of distance, Arthur, the man who had forgotten his son's name, who had forgotten who he was, who had even forgotten the way home, lifted a trembling hand and took Maeve's. His fingers threaded through hers, tight, the grip of someone about to sink, clinging to the last float. And he said nothing, didn't scream, didn't cry. He only held on, his eyes closed, and on the lined, ravaged face marked by time, by illness, by 22 years of unrelenting grief, something appeared for the first time, something Beckett had thought he would never see again on his father's face. Peace. Fragile. Thin as a petal, but real. The peace on Arthur's face lasted less than 10 seconds before the clack of leather shoes on marble shattered it. Gerald, the manager of the Meridian, 45 years old, round-faced, sweat shining on his forehead, finally found courage somewhere in the knot of his own twisting stomach, and stepped out of the dark corner where he'd been hiding for the past half hour. He moved fast, his stride trying to look decisive, shoulders squared, chin lifted, his whole body, a cheap little play about authority, the kind of authority borrowed from the title printed on the name tag pinned to his chest, without a single ounce of it being real. He stopped 3 steps from Maeve, flicked his eyes toward Beckett to gauge the reaction, then turned to the girl sitting on the floor, her hand still woven into Arthur's, her white dress soaked with wine and speckled with glass. "Mr. Rourke, I'm terribly sorry," Gerald said, his voice trembling at the end of the sentence even as he tried to hide it, and his bow toward Beckett dipped so deep it was almost a fold at the waist. "This girl is new, not even 2 weeks. She doesn't know the rules. She doesn't understand protocol. I'll handle it immediately. Maeve, get up, go into the kitchen. You're fired." He delivered the last line in a completely different voice, the voice reserved for people beneath him, sharp, clipped, contemptuous, and his right hand came up, his finger shaking but still reaching toward Maeve's shoulder, about to touch, about to grab, about to drag her off the floor, the way you'd yank a misplaced mop. His finger never got the chance. Beckett's hand caught Gerald's wrist in midair, so fast no one saw when he moved, only the result. Gerald with his arm raised, and Gerald on his knees, kneecaps slamming into marble, his mouth opening on a groan that died in his throat. The force in Beckett's grip wasn't the force of sudden anger. It was precise, controlled, enough to make every small bone in Gerald's wrist feel the future of being crushed. But not crushed yet. Not quite. Just enough for him to understand the distance between intact and permanently crippled, lived inside a single decision by the man standing over him. "Touch her," Beckett said, his voice low and level, never rising, never falling. The voice everyone who knew him understood was the most dangerous of all, more dangerous than when he shouted, more dangerous than when he slammed a table, because it meant he was fully awake and fully willing, and you'll never use that hand again. Gerald went from red to white to gray in 2 seconds. Beckett let go. Gerald collapsed onto the floor, clutching his wrist, eyes wide, mouth working, producing nothing but harsh, panicked breaths. He crawled backward, forced himself upright, staggered into the shadows by the kitchen, and vanished behind the velvet curtain as if he'd never existed at all. Beckett stood in the center of the restaurant and turned slowly, his gaze sweeping each table, each face, each pair of eyes trying to avoid him and failing. Chicago's upper crust, the real estate moguls, the diamond-wearing wives, the politicians, the lawyers, the people accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, all of them sat rigid in their chairs, chests tight, trying to make themselves as small as possible under the eyes of Beckett Rourke. "Everyone out," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Those 2 words hit the walls, bounced back, and filled every corner of the room, right now. Silence shattered. Chairs scraped against marble. High heels clicked in frantic bursts. Fabric whispered. Whispers broke into panic. Handbags were squeezed as if they held life itself. Chicago's elite surged toward the doors, pressing, stumbling, dropping napkins and phones. Elegance stripped clean in 30 seconds, revealing beneath it the same wild instinct money can't buy, the instinct of prey when the predator orders them to run. Tate and 2 other guards escorted them, held the exit, made sure the stream of bodies poured out without turning back. Within 3 minutes, the Meridian was empty. The last footsteps died behind the heavy wooden doors as they slammed shut. And then there were only 3 people left. Candles still burned on every table. Hundreds of small flames trembling in the hollow space, throwing shadows on the walls, the ceiling, the floor where wine still pooled in dark red puddles among shattered crystal. The music from the sound system had been cut long ago. The air conditioning hummed softly somewhere overhead, the scent of scented wax, sour wine, and expensive perfume lingering in the air mixed into something strange, the smell of luxurious ruin. Arthur still sat beside the piano, eyes closed, his hand holding Maeve's, that fragile piece still resting on his face like dew on a flower petal, able to vanish at any moment, but still there for now. Maeve remained on the floor, knees aching, dress wet, fingers going numb inside Arthur's hand, but she didn't pull away. She heard Beckett's footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. He circled past table 12, past chairs shoved out of place, past the puddle of wine, past a gold-rimmed porcelain plate lying on the floor like the husk of a firework, and stopped in front of her. She had to lift her head to see him. He stood there, tall, dark, the line of his body cutting across the candlelight behind him into a sharp black silhouette. His eyes looked down at her, and the intensity in that gaze was enough to bring down anyone with a timid heart. But Maeve wasn't timid. She'd looked into her stepfather's eyes when he held a broken beer bottle by the neck, and she hadn't closed hers. She wasn't going to close them now. "What's your name?" Beckett asked. 3 words, but the way he said them didn't sound like the way he'd said anything else tonight. Not cold, not threatening, not an order. His voice was rough, low, and carried something he might not even recognize in himself, something that sounded like a plea. "Maeve," she answered. "Maeve Holloway." He repeated her name, only the name, not the last one, a whisper, "Maeve." And the sound of it was strange on his mouth, unlike any name he'd ever spoken, unlike the name of an enemy, unlike the name of a subordinate, unlike a name on a contract or a headstone. It was soft, and that softness irritated him, like a pebble in a shoe, small but impossible to ignore, and he knew it would stay there longer than he wanted. Maeve looked around. The restaurant was empty, vast, opulent, silent, candles burning for no one, wine spilled for no one, tables set for guests who'd run, and in the middle of all that gorgeous emptiness, 3 human beings. An old man holding her hand and smiling in a half-sleeping, half-waking haze. A mafia boss standing in front of her, eyes full of something he didn't want to feel. And her, Maeve Holloway, 27 years old, an unemployed waitress, rent 2 months late, hands calloused, neck scarred, who'd just knelt on the floor of a 5-star restaurant among spilled wine and shattered crystal. She looked down at Arthur's hand wrapped around hers, looked up at Beckett, and in that moment she understood, clearly, sharply, cold as a blade, that she'd just stepped through a door she couldn't walk back through. Her life, from this second on, from the first note she'd pressed on the piano of a stranger, from the moment she knelt among the broken pieces, from the moment she'd spoken what no one was allowed to know, her life would never be the same again. and she didn't know whether that was a blessing or a curse. She only knew Arthur's fingers were warm in her hand, and that was enough. It had to be enough. The black sedan slid out from the rear exit of the Meridian, like a nocturnal animal melting into shadow. Rain began to fall. Not hard. Just enough to turn the city into a smeared painting through the window, neon bleeding into long red, gold, and green streaks across the wet road, and Maeve sat in the back seat between Arthur and Beckett, feeling as if she were wedged between two worlds that didn't claim her. The leather was cold. The scent of new hide, mixed with Arthur's heavy cologne, and something else from Beckett. Expensive tobacco, and something cold, like winter air, like iron, like distance. The wipers swept across the windshield in a steady rhythm. Swish, 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 a metronome counting out the silence that was filling the tight space inside the car. Maeve knew she should be afraid. The rational part of her, the part that had kept her alive for 13 years since she'd run from her stepfather's house with a cut on her throat and not a dollar in her pocket, was screaming that she was sitting in a mafia boss's car at midnight, heading somewhere she didn't know, with men she didn't know, and no one on earth knew where she was. That part was screaming that she'd seen enough violence in her life to understand powerful men never gave anything for free, that kindness in their world always had a price, and she would pay, sooner or later, one way or another. But Arthur's fingers were holding hers. He sat to her left, his head tipped onto her shoulder, eyes closed, breathing even but heavy, and his fingers were threaded through hers with the force of a drowning man clinging to the last piece of wood in an endless sea. She knew that grip. She remembered it. Room 14B, 3 a.m, her mother holding her hand the same way, squeezing so hard the blood in Maeve's fingers went numb, so hard Maeve had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound, yet she never pulled away, not once, because she knew her hand was the only thing keeping her mother in this world. And the last time she pulled her hand away, her mother died. At the same time, in a darker corner of her mind, that familiar practical voice whispered again. Gerald had fired her. She had no job. The rent was 2 months late. The landlady had taped a final warning to her door the week before, and if Maeve went back tonight, she would go back to a changed lock and her belongings tossed into the hallway. Following Beckett Rourke meant that at least tonight she had a roof. At least tonight she wouldn't sleep in a subway station or in a hospital waiting room the way she had before. She hated herself for thinking it. She hated the cold, calculating part of her, the part that put survival above pride, the part that turned every decision into an equation of cost and benefit. But the truth was still the truth, no matter how much she despised it. She was here because Arthur needed her, and she was here because she also needed a place to sleep. Both things were real. Both were ugly. Both were her. On her right, Beckett stared out the window, his face a faint reflection on the rain-slit glass, features sharp as a blade, eyes open, yet not looking at the city. He was aware of every movement she made, every breath, every time she shifted her shoulder so Arthur could lean more comfortably, every time her fingers tightened in quiet response to his father's grip. He wanted to ask about the scar, a long, thin line of silver running along her neck, catching the streetlights whenever they swept past the window, then vanishing, then catching again, then vanishing. Who had put that scar there? With what? When? Why she was still alive? But he didn't ask. He didn't know how to ask. 22 years of building walls, building fortresses, building an empire, had taken away the language he would have needed to speak to another human being without issuing an order, a threat, or a bribe. He was a king who didn't know how to be a man. So he looked out at the rain and stayed silent, and felt her presence like a faint burn on his skin that he couldn't scratch. The car turned onto a long, dark road, iron fencing rising on both sides, old oak trees looming beyond it. Then the gate appeared. Massive, hand-wrought scrollwork. Security cameras blinking red atop each pillar. It opened slowly, silently, and the sedan slid through as if swallowed by darkness. The Rourke estate revealed itself little by little beyond the trees, and Maeve had to bite her lip to keep from drawing too sharp a breath. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress. Gray stone, sharp angles, tall narrow windows like arrow slits, a roofline cutting into the night sky, and behind it Lake Michigan stretched out in black infinity, waves striking the rocky shore, with a sound like the whisper of something ancient and dangerous. Pale yellow light spilled from a few windows, but most of the mansion lay in darkness, as if it were deliberately hiding, refusing to be seen, refusing to be known, like its owner. The car stopped at the front steps. The door opened, and from the shadow of the portico, a man stepped forward, 58 years old. A gray suit, the kind of gray that blended into fog, the kind of gray worn by someone who wanted to be present without being noticed until it was too late. Silver hair slicked back, a lean face with high cheekbones, and the eyes, those eyes were the first thing Maeve registered. Sharp, narrow, without warmth, like a hawk's, like the eyes of a man accustomed to calculating other people's life and death before breakfast. Harlan Webb, advisor, right hand, the man who had kept the Rourke empire turning on blood and silence for 30 years. "Who is she, Beckett?" Harlan asked, his voice flat, polite in the way a man could slit your throat and still smile. His gaze raked over Maeve from head to toe, from her copper-brown hair coming loose, to the white dress damp with wine and dust, down to her worn flat shoes, and his mouth curved, not quite a smile, closer to contempt. But Maeve, who had looked into Beckett Rourke's eyes without blinking, looked into Harlan Webb's and saw something else. Behind the contempt, behind the cold control, something was coiling fast and deep, like a snake whose tail had been stepped on. Fear. She didn't understand why a man like Harlan Webb would fear her, an unemployed waitress with dishwashing calluses on her hands. But she saw it, clearly, because she'd lived with fear long enough to recognize it in any eyes. Beckett stepped out and helped Arthur to his feet. Maeve followed, still holding the old man's hand. Beckett didn't look at Harlan when he answered, his gaze fixed on the front door, his voice carrying a weight that made the air thicken around it. "Treat her the way you treat me, or you'll learn how quickly the rules can be rewritten." Harlan didn't reply. He only inclined his head slightly, the inclination of a man swallowing poison without letting anyone see the bitterness, then stepped back to make room. And as Maeve passed him, climbed the cold stone steps, and the heavy oak door opened ahead, warmth spilling out from inside yet carrying a strange scent, the scent of marble, the scent of fresh flowers arranged in vases no one smelled, the scent of lonely wealth. She felt one truth more clearly than anything else that night. This wasn't a home. This was a battlefield. And she, Maeve Holloway, was the only one walking into it without a weapon. Arthur Rourke's room sat at the end of a long second-floor corridor, behind two carved oak doors so heavy it took both hands to push them open, and the moment Maeve stepped inside she understood why the air in here felt thin enough to steal breath. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a museum. Every surface was marble or gold, the walls paneled in dark walnut, the ceiling soaring high with a chandelier smaller than the one at the Meridian, but still large enough to cast a cold light that made the room look like a coffin plated in gilt. A king-size bed with a hand-carved mahogany frame, white silk sheets, goose-down pillows, everything so perfect it felt sterile, like a luxury hotel room no one ever slept in, like a magazine spread no one ever lived in. There were no family photographs on the walls, no half-read book on the nightstand, no glass of water, no slippers, no trace at all that a flesh-and-blood human being existed in this room. There was only excess, splendor, emptiness, and cold. Maeve led Arthur in, still holding his hand, her footsteps silent on a Persian rug, so thick it swallowed every sound. Beckett stood in the doorway and didn't come in, his eyes tracking her as she guided his father to the edge of the bed, helped him sit down gently. Then he nodded once to Tate, turned, and disappeared into the hallway without a word. The door closed, and Maeve was alone with Arthur, inside the museum room, inside the house of a mafia boss, in the middle of a Chicago night. She knelt in front of Arthur. He sat on the edge of the bed, back curved, shoulders slumped, the episode at the restaurant, and the long drive having drained what little energy remained in his 71-year-old body. He looked at her with eyes that were clouded but carried a strange, innocent curiosity, the way a child looks at a stranger, not afraid, not wary, only curious, as if he were trying to remember who she was, but the memory ran through his fingers like sand. Impossible to grasp, impossible to hold. Maeve took off his shoes, slowly, one at a time. Black polished Oxford leather, red soles, the kind of shoes whose price could keep her alive for 3 months. She set them neatly at the foot of the bed, then pulled off his thin socks, folded them, and placed them on top of the shoes. She moved with a quiet, steady rhythm, unhurried, each gesture deliberate, each motion carrying an intentional ordinariness, creating a tiny island of something familiar, simple, human, in the middle of this ocean of excess and strangeness. She drew back the covers, helped Arthur lie down, adjusted his pillow, pulled the blanket up to his chest, and she'd done each of those motions hundreds of times before. For her mother, in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant, on an iron bed that squeaked every time you turned, where the sheets weren't silk but rough cloth washed so many times it had thinned to paper. What she was doing for Arthur tonight, she'd done for her mother every night, and her hands remembered, her body remembered, even if her mind was somewhere else. Arthur lay still. His eyes stared up at the ceiling, then shifted slowly, searching, until they settled on Maeve's face where she sat at the edge of the bed. He raised a hand, trembling, touched her wrist. Then his fingers slid down, found her hand, and held it. Held tight, like in the restaurant, like in the car, as if her hand were the only rope keeping him from falling into an abyss. And he spoke, softly, hoarse, broken. Only one word. But the weight of that word was enough to grind Maeve's heart into powder. Brianna. He called her by the name of his dead daughter. He looked at her, and in those clouded eyes Maeve saw something flare. Not clarity, but love. A love that had survived 22 years of illness and loss. A love that, even when the mind had forgotten everything else, his son's name, his own name, the way home, still remained, still beat, still called for the child who'd been in the ground for 2 decades. Maeve didn't correct him. She didn't say, "I'm not Brianna." She didn't explain, didn't fix it, didn't drag him back to a brutal reality. 2 years in a psychiatric ward had taught her reality wasn't always the best thing for someone in pain. Sometimes illusion was the only buoy that kept them afloat. Her eyes blurred with wetness, tears rising to the rims, but she didn't blink, didn't let them fall, because if she cried now Arthur would feel it, and he would panic, and the fragile peace on his face would shatter. So she swallowed the tears, swallowed the ache, swallowed the scream climbing in her chest, and when her voice came, it was steady, warm, soft, without a crack. "I'm here. I'm here." 4 words, repeated, like a lullaby, like a vow. Arthur closed his eyes. His fingers still gripped her hand, but the strength eased, like a tide pulling back after it hits shore. His breathing slowed, evened out, deepened, and his face, the face that had been twisted in pain all night, finally softened. He slept, truly slept, not dozing from exhaustion, not dropping into unconsciousness from sedatives, but sleep, the sleep of a child holding his mother's hand, safe sleep, the sleep Beckett had said he hadn't had since the day Brianna died. Maeve didn't pull her hand away. She slid down to the floor. Gently, slowly, her back against the bed frame, her head tipping back to rest against the edge of the mattress, her right arm raised, her fingers still woven into Arthur's. The room darkened when she turned off the bedside lamp with her left hand, leaving only moonlight slipping through thin curtains, laying a long silver streak across the marble floor. And in the darkness, in the unfamiliar house, on the cold floor, Maeve looked at the old man's hand threaded through hers, and she thought of her mother. Room 14, B, 3 in the afternoon. She was 16, running down the hospital corridor, sneakers slapping tile, her heart pounding like it would split. A nurse saying her mother wasn't breathing anymore, and when she reached the door it swung open. The white iron bed, her mother lying there, the white sheet already pulled over her face, and her mother's hand, the hand that had held Maeve so tight it left bruises, lay limp over the edge of the bed, cold, empty, with no one holding it. She'd been 20 minutes late. 20 minutes. And her mother had died alone. Maeve's tears fell in the dark, silent, no sobbing, only wetness. She squeezed Arthur's hand gently. This time, she wouldn't be late. Morning light in the Rourke mansion didn't look like the light Maeve was used to. It was cold, filtered through tall, narrow window glass, falling onto marble floors in bands of silver white that carried the scent of distance. The kind of light that belongs to a place where no one laughs in the morning, where there's no rushed coffee smell, no low radio playing in a kitchen. Maeve woke on the floor of Arthur's room, her neck stiff, her back aching, her right hand numb from being held up all night so Arthur could hold on. He was still asleep, breathing evenly, his face strangely peaceful. And when she gently drew her hand away, finger by finger, so slowly it took nearly 2 minutes, he only shifted once and settled again, his lips moving faintly as if he were speaking to someone inside his dream. She stood, her legs tingling, her white dress wrinkled and still carrying the smell of wine and cold stone, and the moment she stepped into the hallway, A house servant in a black suit, expressionless, was already there as if he'd been waiting all night. "Mr. Rourke wants to see you. The study. First floor." Beckett's study sat in the southeast corner of the estate, and Maeve knew she was stepping into his private territory the instant she crossed the threshold. The room was nothing like the rest of the house. No marble, no gold, only dark oak, bookshelves rising to the ceiling, heavy curtains drawn tight, and an enormous desk planted in the center like a judge's dais. Beckett sat behind it, and if last night, for one brief moment on the restaurant floor, Maeve had glimpsed something soft in his eyes, this morning it was gone completely. His face was cold, not the cold of anger, but a deliberate cold, honed over 22 years, the cold of a man who had decided last night was a mistake, that softness was a weakness, that the door that had cracked open had to be slammed shut and welded back with steel. He didn't invite her to sit. He didn't ask whether she'd slept. He didn't mention his father, the piano, the garden of red lilies, or anything that had happened in the night, as if it were all a dream he'd chosen not to remember. On the desk in front of him were two things: a thick cream-colored envelope, unsealed, open just enough for Maeve to see the neat stack of cash inside. $100 bills, thick enough to cover 6 months of rent, maybe more, and beside it, a small business card, embossed on heavy stock: Dr. Heinrich Weiss, MD, PhD, specialist in dementia and neurodegenerative disorders, the University of Chicago. Beckett slid both toward her, a short, decisive motion, the way he'd slide a contract to a partner. "You helped last night. I'm repaying it. The envelope is enough to get you stable for a while. Dr. Weiss is the best. He'll come this afternoon to evaluate my father." He paused, eyes fixed on her. The look she'd seen last night when he'd asked her name replaced now by a carefully measured blankness. "You can go." 3 words, clean, neat, like cutting a stitch, like closing a file, like the way he ended every transaction in his life. Money in exchange for service. Service completed. Each side walks away. Maeve stared at the envelope, and her hands trembled, not from fear, not from anger, but because she needed that money so badly she could hear her landlady pounding on her door inside her skull, could see the final warning taped there, could see the lock changed, could see her few belongings stuffed into black trash bags in the hallway. She needed that money the way she needed air, and it was right there, an arm's length away. All she had to do was pick it up, say thank you, walk out, and return to her old life. The life she knew how to survive, the life where everything hurt but it was familiar. But Maeve didn't take the envelope. She looked up, met Beckett's eyes, and spoke. "He won't talk to Dr. Weiss." Beckett didn't move. Only his jaw tightened by a fraction, almost imperceptible. But Maeve noticed, because she'd spent her life reading the body language of dangerous men, and she knew a tightening jaw meant she'd touched something he didn't want touched. "My father isn't your responsibility," he said, his voice flat but edged, like a razor hidden in silk. "Yes," Maeve said, "he isn't." She paused, not for drama, but because she was swallowing tears, fast and hard, so that when she continued, her voice would stay steady, even, unbroken. "But he held my hand all night, Mr. Rourke, and the last time someone held my hand like that," she drew in a slow, controlled breath, "was my mother, before she died alone in room 14B at the State Psychiatric Hospital. No one held her hand when she went. I was late, 20 minutes. And I've lived with those 20 minutes every day since. Silence. Not an empty silence, but a silence with weight, pressing down on the oak desk, pressing down on the envelope of cash, pressing down on Dr. Weiss's card, pressing down on Beckett Rourke, the man who had spent his whole life building walls so no one could see inside. He looked at her, and he hated what he saw. Not hatred for her, hatred for the honesty in her eyes. Honesty stripped bare, without armor, without an agenda, without calculation. He lived in a world where everyone wanted something from him, where every smile had a price, where every kindness was a down payment on a request. He'd built an empire on that principle, that kindness was currency and no one gave anything away for free. And this girl, this unemployed waitress with a scar on her neck and rent 2 months overdue, was sitting in front of him, hands shaking because she needed the thick envelope of money, yet refusing to take it, speaking about her mother without begging for pity, without performing suffering, just telling the truth, plain and direct. And that truth was something Beckett couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, couldn't control. She was a variable outside every equation he'd ever written. She was an anomaly his calculating mind couldn't process, and that was more dangerous than any enemy he'd ever faced. He should send her away. He knew that. Every nerve in his body, every lesson he'd learned in 22 years in the dark, was screaming to send her away, pay her, shut the door, forget. But this morning, when he replayed the security footage before calling her down, he had seen her sitting on the floor of his father's room all night, back against the bed, arm raised so his father could hold on, eyes open in the dark, not sleeping, not complaining, not leaving, and his father had slept. For the first time in 3 years, his father had slept in peace. Beckett's jaw worked. His fingers tapped the desk once, twice, then stopped. 1 week, he said, his voice slicing through the silence like a knife through cloth. You have 1 week. After that, Dr. Weiss takes over, and you'll leave. He pushed the envelope a little closer to her. Maeve looked at it, then looked back at him. And she didn't take it. She didn't touch it. She simply stood, gave a small nod, turned, and walked out the door. The envelope stayed on the desk, white, thick, full of money. Between them, like a border both of them knew existed but neither one said out loud. Beckett watched her go. The door shut. He looked down at the envelope no one had taken, and he knew, clearly and sharply, that he had just let her stay even though every instinct told him to send her away. He had built another wall this morning, thicker, higher, but there was already a crack in it, thin as a hair, almost invisible, but real, and he didn't know that the crack would never heal. The first night inside the Rourke estate stretched as if it had no bottom. After Maeve soothed Arthur to sleep, she closed his door gently, and instead of returning to the guest room, a servant had prepared for her at the far end of the second-floor hallway. She followed the moonlight. Barefoot on cold marble, her wrinkled white dress replaced by pajamas someone had left on the bed. Too big, too soft, too expensive for a girl used to wearing clothes from thrift stores. She walked down the long corridor, past oil paintings in gilded frames she didn't stop to study, through a tall glass door, and out onto a balcony. Chicago lay in the distance, blazing like a fire someone had forgotten to put out. Millions of lights flickering on the far side of the black expanse of Lake Michigan, and whined off the lake swept onto the balcony with a damp cold that cut through the thin fabric, cut into skin, cut into bone. But Maeve didn't go back inside. She stood there with both hands gripping the iron railing, staring at a city she'd lived in for 13 years and never belonged to, and for the first time since she'd walked out of the kitchen door at the Meridian, she let herself breathe. Really breathe. Not the controlled breathing she used beside Arthur. Not the held breath she used when she faced Beckett. But breathing for herself, deep and shaking, and the exhale carried a small tremor in the base of her throat she couldn't control. Where was she? What was she doing? She, Maeve Holloway, the girl who'd slept in shelters since 14, washed dishes for pay since 15, waited tables since 18, lived her whole life in rooms she could cross in 4 steps, was now standing on the balcony of Chicago's mafia boss, looking down at a garden as wide as the whole neighborhood she used to live in. And the 71-year-old man in the room behind her was sleeping peacefully because she'd held his hand. The footsteps behind her didn't make her turn. She'd heard him coming before he appeared. Leather shoes on marble, heavy but slow, tired. Nothing like the deliberate stride she'd heard this morning outside the office. Beckett stepped onto the balcony and stopped 2 steps away, leaning his back against the wall. Not the railing, not beside her, keeping the exact distance he kept from everything in his life. But he looked different. His tie was loosened, the top buttons of his shirt undone, his forearms exposed where he'd rolled his sleeves, blue veins raised under the skin, and in the moonlight his face had lost the armor it wore in daylight. He looked less like a boss. He looked more like a worn-down man who'd been awake too many nights, carried too much for too long, and was trying not to collapse. He's asleep, Maeve said without turning, her eyes still on Chicago. It wasn't a question. She knew he'd come because of Arthur. He hasn't slept through the night since, Beckett began, then stopped. His voice caught in the middle of the sentence, not because he'd forgotten a word, but because the name about to leave his mouth was a name he'd never spoken aloud to anyone outside. Brianna, his sister. The 8-year-old who'd hated piano, loved to run, called him Beck, and died in the Red Lily Garden 22 years ago. He'd spoken of her to his father, to himself on sleepless nights, to the dark, but never to another living person. That name was a wound he kept private, and saying it meant letting someone look into that wound. And he didn't let anyone look into any of his wounds. So he stopped. The sentence hung in the cold air, unfinished, aching in its unfinishedness. Maeve didn't ask. She didn't press. She let the half-spoken words lie between them, respecting his silence, because she knew there were wounds you weren't allowed to touch even when the other person was bleeding right in front of you. The quiet stretched. Lake Michigan wind blew. Then Beckett spoke again, low, asking what he'd wanted to ask since last night. And it wasn't about the scar. Why did you stay? You saw the guards. You saw me order the whole restaurant out. You know who I am. Why didn't you take the money and go? Maeve turned to look at him, for the first time since he'd stepped onto the balcony. In the moonlight, the scar on her neck gleamed silver, clearer than it had been in daylight, and she didn't cover it, didn't tilt her head, didn't hide it. She just let it sit there in the open, as if it were part of her answer. I've lived in the dark my whole life, Mr. Rourke, she said, her voice even, not defiant, not self-pitying, just stating a fact the way you'd state that the air was cold. Your darkness isn't the first one I've walked into. Her fingers lifted and brushed the scar, lightly, without thinking. The gesture of someone who'd lived with a wound so long it had become habit. Then she tilted her head, looked at him, and added. And this time her voice carried an edge she knew would cut, knew would hurt, and she said it anyway. You're lost too, just like he is. You're just better at pretending. The air on the balcony froze. Not from the wind, from Beckett. She saw the moment her words hit a place no one was allowed to touch. The moment his eyes went dark, his jaw locked, his body shifted from tired to dangerous in a tenth of a second, like a switch flipping, like a blade sliding free. You don't know anything about me. His voice wasn't cold anymore. It was hot. Hot the way boiling tar is hot. Thick, dangerous, burning anyone who stood too close. He pushed off the wall, turned, stepped inside, and the glass door slammed behind him, hard, but not hard enough to shatter, just hard enough for Maeve to feel the rush of air slap her face. She stood alone on the balcony. Lake Michigan wind cut through the thin fabric, cold enough to raise gooseflesh on her skin. But she didn't go in. She stood there looking down at her hands, gripping the railing, and realized what she'd always known, but never admitted. She'd used the truth to push him away, not because she wanted to help him face himself, because she was afraid. Afraid of closeness. Afraid that if he stood there one more minute, asked one more question, looked at her with that tired gaze one more second, she would start to get used to it. And getting used to it was the first step toward losing it. She'd learned that lesson from her mother, from Miss Odell, from everyone she'd ever loved and ever lost. If she pushed them away first, if they left angry because of something she said, then she didn't have to hurt when they left later for reasons that were theirs. That was her core flaw. The armor made of thorns she put on whenever anyone got too close, and she knew it was destroying her, knew it was making her lonely, but she didn't know how to take it off. She inhaled, deep, cold, and when she exhaled, her breath turned to white smoke in the night air. She meant to go back inside when her eyes slid across the glass door, and she saw it. In the dark hallway beyond the glass, a figure stood perfectly still. Not Beckett. He was gone. His footsteps had faded long ago. This figure was smaller, thinner, and when she forced her eyes to focus through the reflected moonlight on the pane, she recognized the gray suit, the silver hair combed back, and the narrow eyes staring straight at her. Harlan Webb. How long had he been standing there? How much had he heard? She didn't know, and before she could see more clearly, the shadow moved, stepped back, merged with the darkness of the hall, and disappeared in silence, as if it had never been there at all. Maeve stood on the balcony, the wind still cutting, Chicago still burning in the distance, and deep in her stomach where survival instinct lived, the instinct that had kept her alive for 13 years, a seed of unease began to sprout. She didn't know what it would grow into, but she knew it would grow. The third day in the Rourke mansion began with winter sunlight, a weak, pallid light that slipped through the large glass doors of the first-floor living room and spread across the oak floor in pale yellow squares carrying a counterfeit warmth, enough to see by but not enough to heat. Maeve sat at the grand piano in the corner, a different instrument from the one at the Meridian. Older, its wood lid darkened by time, a small scratch on the side that made her think a child had once struck it with a toy years ago, and the keys slightly yellowed where they'd been used most. the imprint of someone's fingers returning to the same notes until the ivory wore down. Brianna's piano. Maeve didn't ask, but she knew. She knew the way she always knew the things this house tried to hide, by listening to the silence, by reading the empty spaces, by seeing a scratch in wood and understanding that a child had loved this piano without knowing how to play it, loved it by tapping, banging, scraping, with the tender brutality of an 8-year-old. Arthur sat in the large armchair 3 steps away, the chair Maeve had pulled closer to the piano that morning, a thin blanket laid across his knees, a cup of warm tea set on the small table beside him. Over the past 2 days she had learned Arthur's rhythm. In the morning he was usually at his clearest, his eyes less clouded, his movements less frantic, his body less rigid. In the afternoon he began to drift, his gaze fogging, his words tangling, calling for the dead. At night the storm came back, and the dark hours were the most dangerous territory of all. So Maeve chose the morning. She played that melody, her mother's song, the simple tune she'd played at the Meridian, played again yesterday afternoon when Arthur grew restless, played whenever he started to slide toward the dark. This time, she played more slowly, more gently, her left hand stumbling less in the octave, because her fingers were beginning to remember the keys, beginning to know the distance, beginning to find their place without looking. The melody spread through the living room, touched the paneled walls, touched the high ceiling, touched the squares of sunlight on the floor, and Arthur closed his eyes. His head tipped slightly to the left, the exact posture he always held when he listened to music, and his right fingers began to tap, softly, slowly, against the arm of the chair, keeping time. Not perfectly in time, a little off, a little slower, but tapping, steady and continuous. And Maeve felt her chest tighten because he was listening, truly listening, not listening the way the lost listen for echoes of the past, but listening the way the living hear music in the present. The piece ended. The final note dissolved into the air. Maeve lowered her hands from the keys, turned to look at Arthur, and her heart stopped for a single beat. Arthur was looking at her, not with the cloudy, wandering gaze she'd known for 2 days, not with the searching look for someone who wasn't there. His eyes were bright, clear, present. Those blue-gray eyes were fixed on her, straight and sharp, and aware in a way Maeve had believed was no longer possible in this man. And he didn't call her Brianna. "You," he said, his voice rough and slow, each word seeming to push through a thick fog before it reached his mouth. "You're the girl who plays music." Stillness. Maeve didn't breathe. She didn't dare, afraid that any movement, any sound, would burst this moment, fragile as a soap bubble. Arthur kept watching her, his head slightly tilted, his brows drawing together, and he was thinking. She could see him thinking, trying to sort the broken pieces in his mind, trying to match the girl in front of him to the memory he'd been calling for 2 days. Then he spoke, slowly, each word dropping heavy as stone. "You're not Brianna." Maeve held her breath. Tears rose to her lashes, but she contained them, held them with every ounce of strength. Because this moment didn't belong to her, it belonged to Arthur. He was clear. He was here. He was recognizing the truth, and she wouldn't steal that from him with her own tears. "No," she answered, her voice gentle, steady even as her mouth trembled. "I'm not Brianna." Arthur nodded, slowly, and on his lined face, Maeve saw sadness, but not the frantic sorrow of an episode. The lucid sadness of someone who knows what he has lost, knows what he is searching for will never return. The adult kind of grief that hurts more than any scream. "Brianna hated the piano," he said, and the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a sob, hanging between the two. "She liked to run, all through the garden, so fast, no one could catch her." His eyes began to dull. Maeve saw the fog rolling back in, swallowing the clear light in his gaze, dragging him toward the loop, toward the garden, toward the screaming. But before the fog could take him completely, Arthur lifted a trembling hand, searching for hers. And he took it. "But you," he said, his voice already drifting, already thinning, like a man speaking from the far side of a river. "You're here." Maeve closed her fingers around his, tight. Tears fell now. She couldn't hold them back anymore, sliding down her cheeks, dropping onto the yellowed white keys. "I'm here," she said. Arthur recognized she wasn't his daughter, recognized she was a stranger, and he still chose her, still held her hand, still wanted her here. Not because she was Brianna, but because she was Maeve, and she was here. Outside the living room doorway, Beckett leaned against the frame, one shoulder against the wall, his right hand gripping the wood trim so hard his knuckles were white. He'd come to check on Arthur the way he did each morning, but he stopped at the door when he heard the piano, and he stayed there, listening to it all, hearing his father call the girl who plays music, hearing his father say, "You're not Brianna," hearing his father's voice for the first time in 3 years carry clarity instead of delirium, and hearing the girl say, "I'm here," through tears. He turned and walked away without entering, back to his study, shutting the door, sitting behind the oak desk, unlocking a drawer, taking out a thin brown folder with a printed label that read, Maeve Holloway, background report. He'd had her investigated the first night. Instinct, habit. Trust no one until you knew everything about them. He opened it and read again, even though he'd already read it twice. Mother, Margaret Holloway, admitted to the Illinois State Psychiatric Hospital when Maeve was 13. Died when Maeve was 16. Diagnosis, schizophrenia, with early onset dementia. Stepfather, Daniel Pruitt. Prior record for domestic violence. Restraining order. Maeve left home at 14 with a neck wound requiring 12 stitches. Street, Catherine Shelter, 14 to 18 years old. Psychiatric hospital volunteer, 2 years, no college degree, no family, no one. He closed the file, set it on the desk, turned his computer monitor, opened the security camera system, found the living room feed, conged the screen. Grainy black and white footage. Maeve sitting at the piano, winter sun behind her forming a halo around her copper-brown hair, her left hand resting on the keys, her right hand holding Arthur's, her eyes still wet, her face in the light carrying a kind of beauty Beckett didn't know how to name. Not the beauty of features or skin, but the beauty of someone who had been broken many times and still chose to stay. He stared at the screen. For a long time, then he whispered, his voice only loud enough for himself in the empty room behind the closed door. Maeve. Her name on his lips for the second time. But this time it was different. The first time in the restaurant, he'd repeated it because it was strange. This time he said it because it was familiar. Familiar in a dangerous way. Familiar in the way a crack in a wall begins to spread. Thin and nearly invisible. But irreversible. The second crack in Beckett Rourke's fortress had appeared, and this time, he didn't build another wall. That same night, while Maeve slept in the guest room at the end of the second-floor hallway, and Beckett sat in his study staring at the camera, and feeds the way a man stares into a fire he doesn't know whether to put out or let burn, Harlan Webb closed the door to his private room in the west wing of the estate, turned the lock, drew the curtains, and sat down in the leather chair behind a desk, far smaller than Beckett's, but holding 100 times more secrets. He poured whiskey and didn't drink it, only held the glass, turning it, watching the amber spiral through the crystal. And his eyes weren't on the liquor. His eyes were on 22 years ago. Harlan Webb at 36, black hair, eyes sharper than they were now, a body tighter, ambition bigger than anything an advisor should ever carry. The biggest shipment of that summer had to cross a state line before midnight. The partner on the other side wouldn't wait. The money wouldn't wait. The chance to rise in Arthur Rourke's trust wouldn't wait. And the shortest route from the warehouse to the meeting point ran through the garden behind the estate. The garden where red lilies grew along both sides of the cobblestone path, the garden where the children played in the afternoons. Harlan knew the kids were there. He'd heard laughter through the study window. He knew Brianna was there. Arthur's 8-year-old daughter, the little girl he'd once carried in his arms, once bought ice cream for, once called sweetheart with a smile that, looking back now, made him want to vomit. He knew, and he still ordered the truck through. Because the deadline wouldn't wait. Because the money wouldn't wait. Because the ambition of Harlan Webb at 36 was bigger than the safety of an 8-year-old child. And in the moment he made that decision, in the brief nod he gave the driver, he calculated the yard was wide enough, the path far enough from where the kids were playing, the truck would pass quickly. No one would notice. No one would get hurt. He calculated wrong. The 3-ton truck turned onto the path, tires crushing stone, moving faster than he'd ordered because the driver was rushing too, afraid of being late, eager to be done, eager to get it over with, and Brianna ran out. The child who hated piano and loved to run, who ran faster than any kid in the neighborhood, running because running was freedom, running because she was 8, and the garden was big, and the afternoon was long, and the red lilies blazed on both sides of the path. She sprinted around the flower bed, cut across the cobblestones, and the driver saw her too late. The brakes, that sound, rubber screaming on stone, metal groaning. Harlan heard it every night in nightmares for 22 years, and it never got smaller, never got duller. Every night it was new as the first time. Then the impact, heavy, brief, ending everything in a fraction of a second. Then silence. A thick, suffocating silence. The silence of a world holding its breath. A silence that lasted 2 seconds but stretched like a lifetime. Then Arthur's scream. That scream. The scream Harlan heard again at the Meridian 3 nights ago. Identical. Not a note different. Because pain doesn't change with time. It freezes. It preserves itself perfectly inside a father's mind. And every time he lost himself, that pain was as fresh as the first day. Harlan stood 30 meters away. He saw everything. The small body on the cobblestones, hair spilled out, one shoe flung far aside, red lilies crushed under the tires around where she lay, and Arthur on his knees beside his child, screaming until his voice broke, screaming until men had to pull him away, screaming until his eyes, the bright, cutting eyes of the most powerful boss in Chicago, went out and never fully lit again. Harlan knew he'd killed a child, and Harlan knew he had to survive. In the 48 hours that followed, he did what he did best. He staged the scene. The truck disappeared. The driver was paid and given a one-way plane ticket. Witnesses were bought with money or bought with fear. The police report read, accident, unknown vehicle, unidentified driver, case closed, perfect, clean, not a stain left, except Arthur. Arthur knew, somewhere, in a corner of a mind already beginning to collapse under the weight of grief. Arthur knew. He looked at Harlan differently in the months that followed, with eyes that held both pain and suspicion, eyes that wanted to believe and couldn't, the eyes of a man trying to fit the pieces back together, while illness stole his ability to assemble them before he could finish. Dementia arriving right on time was almost a blessing for Harlan, because it swallowed Arthur's memory before that memory could harden into an accusation. For 22 years, Harlan Webb lived inside the fortress of that secret. For 22 years, he sat at Arthur's table, called him brother, clapped Beckett on the shoulder, watched a 15-year-old boy grow into a 37-year-old boss, smiled, advised, guided, and every second of every minute he knew that beneath all that painted loyalty lay the corpse of an 8-year-old child, and he survived. Because Arthur didn't remember, until now. Harlan set the whiskey down on the desk, his little finger trembling faintly, the only sign of fear he allowed his body to show. That girl, Maeve Holloway, the waitress with those deep eyes that could listen to things other people couldn't hear. The girl who made Arthur sleep, who made Arthur tap his fingers to the rhythm of music, who made Arthur look at her this morning and say, "You're not Brianna," with the clearest eyes he'd had in 3 years. Every day she stayed here, Arthur came back a little more. Every day she played piano, every day she held his hand. The fog in his head thinned another little bit. And when the fog cleared completely, Arthur would remember. The truck, the path, the brakes. Harlan standing 30 meters away. And when Arthur remembered, Arthur would speak. And when Arthur spoke, Beckett would know. And when Beckett knew, Harlan would die. Not the way people say it. Really die. Beckett Rourke wasn't a man who forgave. Harlan pulled a phone from a locked drawer, a disposable phone, unregistered, bought with cash at a convenience store outside the city. He dialed a number he knew by heart, waited through 3 rings, and when the other end picked up, his voice was flat and cold, not shaking, because Harlan Webb had survived for 22 years by controlling his voice, while everything inside him collapsed. The plan changes. Saturday night. Take the old man alive. We need his signatures on the transfer papers before he disappears. The girl is a witness. Eliminate her, but do not damage the asset. Remove the SIM. Snapped it in half. Dropped it into the whiskey. Watched the plastic sink into amber. And upstairs, Arthur Rourke slept peacefully, his hand clenched around a napkin folded into the shape of a bird Maeve had made for him that afternoon. And Maeve, the girl who played music, lay curled in the guest room at the end of the hallway, Miss Odell's embroidered handkerchief pressed to her chest, sleeping the first dreamless sleep she'd had since stepping into the Rourke estate. Neither of them knew that on Saturday night, when they believed themselves safest, death would knock at the door. The 4th day, Maeve found that room entirely by accident. In the afternoon, after Arthur finished his nap, she walked the 2nd-floor corridor looking for the laundry room because the outfit she'd worn the night of the restaurant, the white dress and the bright red apron, was still rolled up in a plastic bag in the corner of her room, sour with old wine and sweat, and she wanted to wash it even though she didn't know whether she'd ever wear it again. Before leaving her room, Maeve took the red apron from the plastic bag, tore a small scrap of the fabric to keep as a memento of her first night, and tucked it into her pocket. The Rourke mansion had 23 rooms. She'd counted over the last 2 days by memorizing every door she passed, most of them open or unlocked. Empty bedrooms with beds made for no one, a library no one read in, sitting rooms no one sat in, the whole estate a museum of loneliness plated in gold. But there was one locked door, at the end of the hallway, past Arthur's suite, just before the corridor turned right toward a back staircase. An oak door like all the others, but with an older brass lock, dulled with age. The kind of lock you didn't replace because you didn't want anyone touching it. Not even a locksmith. Maeve didn't mean to trespass, but her hand, out of habit, tested the knob as she passed, and it turned. The lock was old, the mechanism worn, the bolt no longer catching cleanly, and the door opened with a faint complaint from hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. The smell hit her first, the smell of time, dust layered on cloth and wood and paper for 2 decades, a faint sweetness of something long dried, the closed room scent of a place whose windows hadn't been opened in 22 years. Then the afternoon light slipped through sheer curtains filmed with dust, and Maeve saw it. Brianna's room, intact, 22 years, and no one had touched a thing. A small bed with a floral quilt, a pillow embroidered with the name Brie in pink thread, faded now. A low shelf packed with picture books and dolls, a brown teddy bear propped against the wall, its glossy black plastic eyes watching Maeve like a silent witness. On the wall, crayon drawings, the crooked lines of an 8-year-old, a house, a tree, a sun, and a tall figure beside a small figure, and beneath it, in slanted block capitals, me and Beck. And on the window ledge, in a small glass jar, a dried red lily. The petals had lost their color, gone from vivid red to a dark brown, thin as paper, brittle enough that a single breath might shatter them. Yet the shape remained, still a flower, still beautiful in the way things that have been dead for a long time can be beautiful if they've been kept carefully enough. Maeve stood in the middle of the room and cried, not loudly, not with sobs. The tears simply ran, free and uncontrolled, down the familiar tracks on her cheeks, falling onto the dust-covered wooden floor. She cried for Arthur, for the old man sleeping in the next room who didn't know that one wall away stood the intact museum of the daughter he'd lost. Every toy, a knife, every drawing, a wound, and he'd kept this room exactly the same for 22 years because shutting it and locking it was the only way he knew to keep Brianna here. She cried for her mother, because when her mother died in room 14B, Maeve wasn't allowed to keep anything. There was no intact room. No dolls, no drawings. The hospital cleared the bed within 2 hours. Personal belongings shoved into a plastic bag and handed to her at the front desk. One small bag, no bigger than a pillow, holding all that was left of a human life. And Maeve, 16 years old, stood in the hospital corridor clutching that plastic bag with nowhere to go. Arthur Rourke was rich enough to preserve a room for 2 decades in grief. Maeve Holloway was poor enough not to have a room to cry in at all. And that brutal contrast pushed her into the biggest mistake she'd made since stepping into the Rourke mansion. She looked at the dried lily, and she thought. 2 years in the psychiatric hospital had taught her that memory loops could sometimes be broken if a patient was gently brought to face the memory itself in a safe environment, with someone trusted beside them, slowly, carefully. She'd watched doctors do it, letting patients see old photographs, hear old songs, touch old objects, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the loop cracked, the patient stepped through, and on the other side was a peace no sedative could buy. If Arthur saw the lily, if he faced the memory instead of being trapped inside it, maybe he would move through. Maybe. She lifted the flower, carefully, her fingers holding the thin petals the way you hold a butterfly's wings, and carried it into Arthur's room. She wasn't a doctor. She knew that. But the confidence of the last 3 days, of getting Arthur to sleep peacefully, of getting him to tap along to the music, of getting him to look at her and say, "You're not Brianna," with clear eyes, that confidence had swollen, had blurred the boundary between knowing enough to help and knowing enough not to harm, and she crossed that boundary without realizing. Arthur sat in his armchair, half awake, half adrift, eyes heavy. And when Maeve set the dried lily on the small table in front of him, she smiled, gentle, safe, full of hope. Arthur looked down. His gaze touched the flower, and the world exploded. The scream that tore from his throat wasn't the howl from the night at the restaurant. It was worse. It was the scream from 22 years ago, the original scream, the scream of the moment he'd knelt beside his daughter's body on a cobblestone path, and the dried lily had opened a door straight into the epicenter. He shoved the table, wood striking the wall, the teacup shattering. He struck Maeve, the strength of a 71-year-old man fueled by panic, strong enough to send her stumbling back 3 steps. He folded into the corner of the room, both hands over his head, screaming Brianna's name, screaming without pause, the sound battering the walls, ricocheting back, filling the room until there was no space left for anything else. Then he grabbed a porcelain vase from the bedside shelf and threw it. Not at Maeve, into the dark, into the memory, into an invisible enemy, but it sailed across the room, and the breaking shards hit her arm, sharp, fast. Maeve felt cold first, then heat, then wet. She looked down and saw blood running along her left forearm from a cut nearly 4 inches long, soaking into her sleeve, dripping onto the marble in dark red drops against white. She didn't scream. She stood there, her right hand pressed over the wound, blood seeping through her fingers, and watched Arthur screaming in the corner, and she knew, with cruel clarity, that she had caused this. The bedroom door flew open. Beckett stood there, his eyes scanning the room in a fraction of a second, reading the situation the way he'd read a battlefield map. Arthur in the corner, screaming, Maeve in the middle of the room, blood, and on the floor, amid broken porcelain and spilled tea, the dried red lily lying on its side, petals snapped, dark brown against white marble. He understood instantly. His gaze moved from the flower to Maeve, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't hot anger. It was cold, colder than anything she'd ever seen, colder than the night air on a balcony, cold in the way a scalpel is cold, precise, without feeling, built to cut clean. You brought a lily into his room, not a question. His voice was low, even, each word dropping into the silence between Arthur's screams like a stone down a deep well. You're not a doctor. You're a waitress. You just destroyed 3 days of progress in 30 seconds. Every word landed like a bullet. No shouting. No need. The calm in his voice was more brutal than any yell, because it meant he wasn't speaking in anger. He was speaking in full clarity, and every word he chose was exact, deliberate, aimed at the most painful place. You're a waitress, not a doctor, not a specialist, not a healer, just a waitress. And she had thought she was more, thought 3 days of playing piano and offering her hand gave her the right to make a clinical decision for a man with dementia, thought understanding someone's pain meant knowing how to cure it, and she was wrong. Wrong in a dangerous way. Maeve stood there, blood dripping onto the floor, and she didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She didn't say I only wanted to help, because he was right. Every word he'd said was right, and that truth hurt more than porcelain slicing skin. She wasn't an angel. She was human. With mistakes, with overgrown confidence, with a blurred line between kindness and pride. And this afternoon, that pride had left a 71-year-old man screaming in the corner and a 27-year-old woman bleeding on marble. Doctor Weiss arrived within 40 minutes, sedated Arthur, stabilized him, and got him into bed. Then he stitched Maeve's arm, 7 stitches, local anesthetic, and through the whole process, as the needle passed through her skin, Maeve didn't flinch, didn't moan. She only sat still, her eyes fixed on the dried lily someone had picked up and set on the table. Its petals snapped, its shape distorted. Like her, like everything she touched, beautiful in intention but broken in reality. That night Maeve couldn't sleep. Her left arm throbbed in time with her heartbeat, 7 stitches tugging at skin every time she shifted. And Dr. Weiss had left pain medication on the nightstand, but she didn't take it, because she felt she deserved this pain, deserved every sharp pulse as a reminder of what she'd caused, of how her overconfidence had driven an old man to scream and curl into a corner like a wounded animal. But her arm wasn't what hurt most. What hurt most was Beckett's voice. You're not a doctor. You're a waitress. Each word still rang inside her head. Sharp, exact, no more and no less. And worst of all, it was true. Completely true. So true she couldn't even be angry at him the way she wanted to be, because getting angry at someone for telling the truth was the kind of self-deception she'd sworn she'd never allow herself. She lay in bed, the ceiling soaring above her in darkness, the wall clock ticking, and the wall between her room and the hallway so thin she could hear the guards' patrol footsteps pass every 15 minutes. Steady, mechanical, reminding her she was living inside the fortress of a man who treated human lives like numbers on a balance sheet. At 1 a.m, she gave up on sleep. She sat up, barefoot, stepped into the hall without turning on the lights. The Rourke estate at night was a different creature. The darkness thicker, the walls higher, the ceiling farther away, and each bare step on the cold marble echoed and was swallowed at once by that hungry silence. She walked toward Arthur's room, not for any specific reason, only because her feet remembered the way, because for the past 3 nights she'd walked this path, and habit was the anchor that held her when everything else slipped away. She stopped at his door, eased it open, and looked in. Arthur was asleep. Moonlight slipped through the curtains onto the bed, and she saw his hand resting on his chest, clenched around something small and white. The napkin folded into the shape of a bird. Maeve had made it for him that afternoon, before everything happened, before the lily, before the screaming, before the blood. She'd sat with him after lunch and folded the linen napkin into a small bird. Wings flared, head tilted, and Arthur had watched her with that childlike curiosity, then taken the cloth bird, turned it over and over, and smiled. A small, thin smile, but real. And now he was sleeping with it in his fist like a child clutching a stuffed animal, his face peaceful, even though he'd screamed himself hoarse earlier. Maeve smiled, thin and sad, then closed the door. She kept walking. She didn't go back to her room. Her feet led her down the staircase, past the first floor, past the darkened sitting room where the piano stood silent like a glossy black ghost, and farther down, to a door she'd never opened, the door that led to the basement. She didn't know why she went down there. Maybe sleeplessness makes people walk into places they shouldn't. Maybe some part of her, the self-destructive part, the part that always chose the wrong door to open, wanted to know what this fortress hid beneath marble and gold. The stairs were narrow, gray concrete, no carpet, no paintings, no pretense of beauty. And with every step she took downward, the air grew colder, damper, heavier. Then she heard it. Voices. Low, even. A voice she recognized immediately, even through thick walls. Beckett. And another sound. A moan. Not the ordinary moan of pain. The moan of someone who'd been moaning too long. A voice worn down to nothing but air forced through a swollen throat. A sound Maeve recognized because she'd heard it in psychiatric wards, from patients restrained too long in beds, but here it carried something else. The flavor of someone being restrained on purpose by someone else. She reached an iron door, eased it open, a slit of yellow light spilling out, and she looked through. Beckett stood in the middle of the basement, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, his forearms bare, and on his hands, on the fingers that had tapped the oak desk when he spoke to her, that had held Gerald's wrist with perfectly controlled force, there was blood. Not much, but enough. In front of him, a man was tied to a chair, head bowed, face swollen, and Beckett was talking to him in a voice that was gentle, low, almost tender. The voice an ordinary man might use to ask after a friend's health. But the content wasn't gentle at all. The content was questions Maeve couldn't make out, and didn't need to, because the scene said everything. Beckett's face held no expression. Not anger, not pleasure, not disgust. Nothing. And that emptiness was more terrifying than any expression, because it meant this wasn't the first time. It wasn't an exception. It was routine. It was work. It was what he did at night while the house slept. The way normal people washed dishes or read a book before bed. Maeve stepped back. Her back knocked lightly against the concrete wall. A soft thud, and her heart went wild, beating so fast she could hear it in her ears, in her throat, in her chest. She knew. She'd known from the start. She'd known who he was from the first night, from the way the guards looked at him, from the way Gerald dropped to his knees, from the way Harlan bowed his head, from the way Chicago's elite ran for the door when Beckett spoke 2 words. But knowing was different from seeing. Knowing was an idea. Seeing was bone and blood and moaning and yellow light and the metallic smell in the air. She scrambled up the stairs, legs shaking, one hand on the wall, the stitches in her arm burning like they were being torn open, and when she reached her room, she shut the door, locked it, leaned her back against the wood, and slid down to the floor. In her mind, an old memory returned without being invited. Her mother, 32 years old, sitting on the kitchen floor, a bruised eye, a swollen lip, telling 7-year-old Maeve that Daddy loves Mommy. Sweetheart, Daddy's just tired. Her mother had loved a violent man. Her mother had stayed. Her mother had found reasons. Her mother had said he's good when he doesn't drink. Her mother had said he needs me. Her mother had kept saying it until her voice broke and her mind broke with it. And now Maeve, 27, was sitting on a bedroom floor in the house of a man with blood on his hands, and she was wondering if she was repeating the same spiral. If she was staying because of Arthur, or because of something else. If he needs me was only another version of he's good when he doesn't drink. She reached into the pocket of her pajamas, and her fingers found old fabric, Miss Odell's embroidered handkerchief, her only keepsake. The cotton was so softened it felt almost ready to fall apart. The lavender stitching faded, but the scent was still there. Faint, lavender and Miss Odell, the scent of St. Catherine's shelter, the scent of safety, the scent of the only woman in Maeve's life who had ever said you deserve to be loved without asking for anything in return. Maeve pressed the handkerchief to her nose, inhaled deeply, and cried. She cried because her arm hurt. She cried because Beckett was right. She cried because of the basement. She cried because of her mother. She cried because she was 27 years old, sitting on a cold floor in a stranger's house, and for the first time since she'd walked out of the kitchen door at the Meridian, she thought seriously, truly seriously, about leaving. The next morning, Beckett sat in his study at 6 o'clock, the way he did every morning. Black coffee on the desk untouched, his eyes on the security camera monitor, and he rewound last night's footage the way a man does when he trusts no one enough to sleep without checking every corner of his fortress before the sun comes up. He watched Maeve leave her room at 1 a.m. He watched her stop at Arthur's door, crack it open, look in, let a thin smile pass across her mouth, then move on. He watched her go down the stairs, cross the first floor, and descend into the basement. And he stopped. His finger went still on the rewind button. On the grainy black and white screen, Maeve stood before the basement's iron door, a slit of yellow light cutting up across her face, and he saw the moment she looked through that gap and saw what was inside, the moment her whole body went rigid, her back hitting the wall. Then she turned and climbed, hands and knees, up the stairs, running back to her room. He rewound forward. The second-floor hallway camera. Maeve sat on the floor inside her room, her back against the door, knees pulled to her chest, one hand cradling her injured arm, the other pressing something small to her face, an old cloth, and her eyes were swollen and red, and she stayed that way all night, never lying down, never turning off the light, never sleeping. Beckett stared at the image of her on the screen, stared for a long time, and what he felt in his chest wasn't anger that she now knew about the basement. It was something else. Something it took him a few seconds to recognize because it was so foreign, so long absent, almost dead in him but apparently only sleeping. Guilt. He hadn't caused the wound on her arm. Arthur had thrown the vase. The porcelain had cut her. It was the consequence of a mistake she had made herself. But watching her sit on the floor with that old cloth, eyes swollen, arm bandaged, he remembered his own voice yesterday afternoon. "You're a waitress," and he wondered whether he'd needed to be that cruel, whether the truth had to be delivered with a blade instead of a hand. And the question unsettled him because it meant he was caring about her feelings, and Beckett Rourke didn't care about anyone's feelings. At 9 a.m, he stood at her door. He knocked. 2 short knocks, evenly spaced, the way he knocked on every door, not asking permission but announcing himself. The door opened, and Maeve stood there in an oversized set of pajamas, hair tangled, eyes swollen and red, the bruised dark circles beneath them heavier than any day before, her left arm wrapped in white gauze with a faint pink stain where blood had seeped through, and she looked at him with an expression unlike any she'd worn before, not the quiet certainty in the restaurant, not the direct gaze on the balcony. This was wary, the look of a feral cat that had been kicked too many times, that knew the difference between a hand that pets and a hand that hits, and was trying to decide which kind his was. Beckett's eyes went to her injured arm for a single second, just long enough for her to notice he'd looked, then returned to her face. "My father asked about you," he said, his voice flat but missing the sharp edge from yesterday, as if someone had dulled the blade overnight. "Dr. Weiss came this morning and reassessed him. He said my father needs an emotional anchor. His words, not mine. He added the last line as if he needed it, understood that he didn't use language that soft, that admitting she mattered to his father was science, not sentiment, and Maeve almost smiled at the clumsy defense. Almost, but she didn't, because she'd seen the basement last night, and smiles didn't come easily anymore. She looked straight into his eyes and said, I saw you last night too. In the basement, there was no wind in the hallway, but the air between them thickened the way it does before a storm. Beckett didn't move. Not a muscle in his face shifted, not his eyes, not his mouth, not his jaw. But that perfect stillness was the sign, because an ordinary man would react, would startle, would explain, would justify, and only someone practiced at hiding could stand absolutely motionless when a secret was exposed. The silence stretched 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 7 seconds. Maeve didn't step back. I know who you are, she said, her voice even, not shaking, not accusing, not afraid, only stating fact. I'm staying for your father, not for you. A line. Clear. Clean. She drew the border. Him on one side, Arthur on the other, and she chose Arthur. Beckett gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned and walked away. And this time he didn't slam the door, didn't cut her off with ice. He simply left, silent, his footsteps heavier than usual, and Maeve watched until he turned the corner and disappeared. That night, at 3 a.m, Maeve sat on the kitchen floor. The Rourke kitchen was larger than her entire old apartment, stainless steel and granite and cabinets rising to the ceiling, but at this hour it was empty and dark, lit only by a small counter light casting a warm yellow pool, and Maeve sat on the tile with her back against a cabinet, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, knees drawn up, and the simple posture of it, sitting on the floor drinking tea, made it the first place in the mansion that felt almost like her. She heard footsteps before she saw him. Beckett entered the kitchen, stopped when he saw her, and for a moment the two of them looked at each other in the soft yellow light, him standing, her seated, like the first night in the restaurant, but different, because there was no shattered crystal here, no screaming, no bodyguards, only 2 sleepless people, and an empty kitchen. He didn't say anything. He went to the liquor cabinet, poured whiskey, then instead of standing at the counter or taking a chair, he looked down at her on the floor, and he sat down, on the cold tile, beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could hear the ice clink in his glass when he took the first sip. Silence. Long, but not heavy. For the first time since Maeve arrived, the silence between them wasn't controlled, wasn't a test. It was simply silence, the kind 2 exhausted people share because they no longer have the energy to keep distance. Maeve spoke first. What was Brianna like? 3 words, gentle, but she felt Beckett stiffen beside her, felt the air around him tighten, and she waited. Not pushing, not asking again, only drinking her tea, eyes on the tile. The silence lasted so long she thought he wouldn't answer, that he'd stand up, leave, slam another door. But he didn't go. She hated the piano, he said, his voice low and rough, and Maeve realized this was the first time in 22 years he'd spoken about his sister to anyone outside the family, because each word sounded like he had to pull it out of his chest the way you pull an arrow out of flesh. Hated the piano, loved to run, ran all over the garden, barefoot, knees always bruised, dresses always torn, called me Beck. Only she called me that. No one else was allowed. He stopped, drank whiskey, and Maeve heard his voice break, small, almost imperceptible. But she recognized it because she'd spent her life listening for what other people missed. He didn't say more, and Maeve, because he'd handed her the most precious thing he owned, handed something back. My mother had the best singing voice in the neighborhood, she said softly, eyes on the tea in her hands. She could sing anything, weddings, funerals, Christmas, ordinary days. She sang whenever she felt like it. She sang me to sleep. She sang while cooking. She sang while doing laundry. Then she started singing to people who weren't there, singing my father's name. My father had been gone a long time, but she sang to him every night, sang until she couldn't tell the difference between a song and a cry. She paused, swallowed. My mother died in room 14B at the state psychiatric hospital. I was late by 20 minutes. When I got there, a white sheet was already over her face. Her hand was hanging off the side of the bed. Cold. Silence. Not the fighting silence of the earlier days, the silence of two people sitting at the bottom of a well, looking up, seeing the same faraway sky. Then Beckett reached out, slowly. His fingers touched her injured arm, touched the edge of the white bandage, so lightly she almost didn't feel it. So lightly it was hard to believe this was the same hand she'd seen smeared with blood in the basement last night. "I'm sorry," he said. 2 words. Maeve knew he wasn't apologizing for the wound. He was apologizing for, "You're a waitress," for the blade in his voice yesterday. Apologizing the way Beckett Rourke apologized. Not with speeches, not with explanations. Only 2 words, and a gentle touch on a wound he hadn't caused but had made hurt more. Maeve looked at his hand on her bandage, then up at his face, and she said the thing she knew would change everything, or ruin everything. And she said it because she was tired now. Tired of pretending, tired of holding distance, tired of drawing lines and standing at the edge while wanting to cross. "You don't have to be strong with me," she said, her voice soft and warm. Not judging, not accusing, not pleading. "I saw you. All of you. The basement. The blood on your hands. The way you spoke to the man who was tied up more gently than the way you spoke to me. I saw everything." She paused for a single beat. "And I'm still here." Beckett didn't speak. He didn't stand. He didn't slam a door. For the first time, when someone saw the darkest part of him and didn't run, he didn't know what to do, because his whole life had been a series of reactions to people who ran or people who attacked, and she did neither. She only sat there on the kitchen floor with her tea and said she was still here. The 3rd crack in Beckett Rourke's fortress didn't open with an explosion. It opened in silence on cold tile at 3 a.m, when his shoulder, somehow, eased against hers. Not much, just contact, cloth against cloth, but he didn't pull away, and she didn't shift away. 2 people on a kitchen floor, a glass of whiskey and a cup of tea, shoulder to shoulder, silent, and for the first time in both their lives, the silence didn't hurt. Saturday night arrived after 3 days. Maeve would remember for the rest of her life as the 3 best days inside the Rourke estate. After the Lily mistake, after the basement, after the kitchen floor at 3 a.m, everything changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way winter turns into spring, so slowly you don't notice until you look back and realize the snow has melted when you weren't paying attention. Maeve played the piano every morning, not forcing Arthur to listen, just playing. And he found his own way to it, pulled his familiar armchair close, sat beside her, tapped the rhythm on the chair arm, and each day his fingers landed a little closer to the beat, his eyes a little brighter, his voice a little clearer, when he murmured along with the melody. She didn't bring anything else into his room. No flowers, no photos, no objects. She'd learned her lesson in 7 stitches. And now she brought the only thing she had any right to bring, her presence. Beckett didn't appear more often, but the distance he kept changed in its nature, from a defensive distance to an observing one, from a fortress wall to a window, still closed, but with glass you could see through. Every morning he paused in the doorway of the sitting room for 30 seconds, watched Maeve play, watched Arthur tap along, then left, and those 30 seconds were more than he'd given anyone in 22 years. And then Saturday night came, and Arthur had his best day since the illness swallowed him. In the morning, he was lucid enough to insist on dressing himself. At noon, he sat at the table, used knife and fork the right way, didn't spill, didn't throw, and he looked at the plate and said, "Salmon." "I like salmon," in a clear voice. Maeve had never heard from him. In the afternoon, when Maeve played the piano, Arthur didn't just listen. He turned to her and said, "You play this one every day, don't you?" And Maeve had to bite her lip to keep from crying, because he was here, truly here, not trapped in a loop. Not lost in the garden, but here, in the sitting room with her, recognizing her routine, recognizing that every day meant she'd been beside him long enough for there to be an every day. But the most unforgettable moment came at 5 p.m. Beckett came into the sitting room, not for the usual 30 seconds, but all the way in, stood in front of his father, and Arthur looked up. His eyes stayed on Beckett, long and searching, his brow tightening, and Maeve could see him trying to match the face in front of him to the right name, trying to pull a thread through the fog, and then the fog parted, thin, just enough for light to come through. "Beckett," Arthur said. Not Brianna, not the wrong name, the right name, his son's name. For the first time in 3 years, Beckett stood there, and Maeve saw something she was sure no one in the world had ever seen. His chest rising on one long breath and lowering slowly, trembling, his jaw clenching not from anger but because if he didn't clench it, his mouth would shake. And if his mouth shook, his eyes would wet. And Beckett Rourke didn't cry in front of anyone. Not ever. He nodded, whispered, "I'm here, Dad," then turned and walked out fast. And Maeve didn't follow, because she knew there were moments when the greatest kindness was letting someone cry alone. At 11 that night, Maeve soothed Arthur to sleep. He held her hand, lighter than the nights before, not the grip of a drowning man, but the grip of someone who believed the life ring would be there when he needed it. He fell asleep quickly, breathing even, face peaceful. Before Maeve gently slipped her hand free, she reached into her pocket and placed a small scrap she had torn from her red apron into his palm, knowing the familiar scent of the kitchen would act as a sensory anchor to keep him from drifting back into the dark. And Harlan Webb was standing there, right outside Arthur's door, leaning on the wall, hands in his pockets, his gray suit paler than usual under the hallway lights, his face cold, flat, controlled, but his eyes were not. For the first time since Maeve had met him on the front steps that first night, she saw real fear in those narrow eyes. Not fear hidden behind contempt, but fear stripped bare and alive, the fear of an animal backed into a corner. "He's getting clearer every day," Harlan said, his voice flat, but with a faint tremor underneath, so slight it was almost invisible. "You're opening doors that shouldn't be opened." Maeve looked at him. Her survival instinct, the thing that had kept her alive for 13 years, was screaming in her gut, and it told her that wasn't advice. It was a threat wrapped in silk with iron underneath. "There are things that are better left alone for everyone," Harlan continued, his gaze sliding past her shoulder to Arthur's door, and when he spoke the next word, his voice carried the weight of 22 years of secrecy. "The lily garden. Someone planted flowers there because they wanted to cover what's underneath. Don't dig it up." He looked back at her, eyes narrowed, and the thin smile on his mouth was so cold, Maeve felt a shiver run down her spine, from the base of her skull to her lower back, the ancient chill a human body feels when it's standing too close to a predator. Then he walked away, silent, his gray suit dissolving into the darkness of the hallway, until he was gone. Maeve stood alone, heart racing, and everything in her, every cell, every instinct, was yelling that something was wrong, that Harlan Webb had just told her more than he'd meant to say, that the fear in his eyes wasn't because Arthur was clearer, it was because Arthur was remembering, and there was something Arthur would remember that Harlan didn't want anyone to know. She needed to find Beckett. She ran down to the first floor, bare feet on cold marble, past the dark sitting room, down the hall to the study. The door shut, low voices inside, Beckett in a meeting, and she lifted her hand to knock and then everything cut out. Lights, every light, the entire estate dropped into absolute blackness in a single second, as if someone had switched off the sun, and Maeve stood in the dark with her hand still raised in midair, eyes wide on nothing, and her heart knew before her mind could catch up that this wasn't an ordinary outage. Gunshots, 2 of them, dry, clean, from the direction of the side gate, the west side of the estate, where Maeve had never been, and the sound cut through the darkness like a knife through silk. Then screams, running footsteps, shattering glass, and Beckett's voice from behind the study door, not shouting but commanding, that steel-cutting voice Maeve had heard the first night at the restaurant. The boss's voice, not the man who'd sat on a kitchen floor at 3 a.m. The study door flew open. Beckett burst out, already holding a gun, eyes sweeping the dark with the speed of a man who'd lived inside danger his whole life. And in a fraction of a second his gaze found Maeve standing in the hallway, barefoot, terrified, and he shouted one word, "Tate." The guard appeared from the darkness like a ghost, huge, silent, gun ready. Beckett spoke in sharp, fast commands. No extra syllable wasted. "Side gate's been opened. 4, maybe more. Target is the 2nd floor. My father." He knew immediately. This wasn't random. It wasn't a rival crew stumbling in. The side gate being opened meant a code, meant a key, meant an inside man. Someone in this house had unlocked the door for the enemy, and that knowledge set fire to Beckett's eyes with something Maeve had never seen in him before. Not anger, betrayal, the deepest pain for a man who'd trusted no one his whole life and, for the first time, realized he should have trusted even less. He turned to Maeve, grabbed her shoulders hard, fingers biting through the fabric. and in the dark his eyes were close, fierce, but at the bottom of them was something else she recognized, because she'd learned to read him in sleepless nights. Worry. He was worried about her. Go to my father's room. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. Anyone. Then he released her, turned, and ran up the stairs with Tate. Two dark shapes swallowed by the dark, their footsteps quick and then gone, and Maeve stood alone in the black hallway with her heart pounding in her ears, and she knew she had to run to Arthur. She had to protect him, because Beckett had said the target was his father, and she remembered Harlan's words, "Don't dig it up." She understood, not fully but enough to be afraid, that all of it was connected, the lily garden, the secret, the fear in Harlan's eyes, and the vicious attack unfolding tonight. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, she turned and ran up the stairs, her bare feet striking cold stone as the darkness swallowed her. And behind her, in the belly of the Rourke estate, the fight began. Maeve ran down the second-floor hallway in absolute darkness, her left hand sliding along the wall to keep her bearings, her injured arm flaring with pain every time it swung, her bare feet slapping cold marble, and she counted doors. 1, 2, 3, 4. Arthur's door was the 5th on the right. She'd walked this route enough nights that her feet remembered every step, even when her eyes couldn't see. Downstairs, another gunshot cracked, closer this time, inside the mansion, not out by the side gate anymore, followed by the sound of breaking glass and a short scream cut off mid-breath, and Maeve didn't stop, didn't think. She just ran, because Arthur was alone in his room in the dark, and he was 71 years old, and he didn't know what was happening, and she'd sworn there wouldn't be one more person dying without someone holding their hand. She reached Arthur's door, shoved it open, lunged inside, and slammed it behind her, twisting the lock with shaking hands. The darkness was thick. Moonlight, filtering through sheer curtains, was only enough to give her outlines. The bed, the chair, the table, and Arthur's shape on the bed, sitting up, not lying down, his back straight, and when her eyes adjusted a little more, she saw his eyes. Open, bright, clear. Not the panicked gaze of an episode. Not the cloudy, wandering stare. Arthur's eyes in that moment were lucid in a terrifying way. The lucidity of someone yanked awake inside a nightmare and realizing the nightmare is real. The lucidity Maeve had prayed for all week, but now, in the dark, under gunfire, it had come at the worst possible time. He was trembling, all over, but he wasn't screaming. His lips moved, and when Maeve got to the bed and dropped to her knees beside him, she heard him whisper, soft but distinct, word by word, not a delirious loop, but memory pouring out like water through a broken dam. Harlan, the truck. Harlan let the truck through the garden, knew the children were playing, let it through. Brianna ran out. The brakes. Harlan stood there watching. Maeve stopped breathing. A door that had been sealed for 22 years inside Arthur Rourke's mind had blown wide open. Not a crack, not a sliver, but fully open, and the memory spilled out like blood from a torn wound. And he was remembering everything. That afternoon, the truck, the cobblestone path, the squeal of brakes, Brianna on the ground, red lilies crushed under the tire, and Harlan Webb, standing 30 meters away, face white, knowing. Arthur's hand clamped around Maeve's wrist with more force than he'd ever used. The force of a man who needed someone to hear him, needed someone to know, before the fog swallowed him again, before he forgot again, maybe for the last time. Harlan killed Brianna, he said, his voice breaking but clear. So clear each word seemed carved into the air. Harlan killed her. Maeve held on to him, tight, with both hands, and she meant to say something, anything. But footsteps in the hall cut through everything. Heavy, fast, coming from the stairs, and they weren't Beckett's steps. She knew his rhythm. His stride was heavy, but even, these were messy, rushed. The steps of someone not used to moving through darkness, an intruder. Two shadows stopped at the door. The handle turned, the lock held, then a kick, hard. The oak door shuddered but didn't give. A second kick and the hinges cried. A third and the door burst inward. Wood splintering, and two men surged into the room. Darkness inside darkness, but moonlight caught the steel in their hands. A quick glint, handguns. Maeve stood, and she stepped forward, toward the men with guns, between them and Arthur. She shielded him with her body thin and small, no armor, no weapon, just bone and skin, and a heart beating so wildly she felt it in her throat. She was scared. Her hands shook violently. Not the small tremor she'd had staring at the envelope of cash, but shaking so hard her bones seemed to rattle, so hard her teeth clicked, so hard she had to clamp her jaw to keep from making a sound. Her breathing went fast and shallow, her lungs forgetting how to draw a full breath. Her legs wanted to run. Every muscle, every primitive instinct in her 27-year-old body was screaming, "Run! Run! You're not a hero. You're an unemployed waitress standing in a dark room with 2 armed men. You're going to die. You're going to die if you don't run." But she didn't run. Room 14B. Her mother dying alone. No hand held. A white sheet over her face. A hand hanging off the side of the bed. Cold. Empty. No one else was going to die without someone holding their hand. Not tonight. Not here. Her right hand found Arthur's hand behind her, gripped it tight, fingers lacing with fingers, and she closed her eyes. She sang. Her mother's song. The simple melody she'd played on the piano at the Meridian. The melody she'd played for Arthur each morning. The tune her mother used to sing in the tiny kitchen of a cheap apartment when Maeve was 8. The tune her mother sang in room 14B, when she no longer recognized her own daughter. Maeve's voice shook, cracked. It wasn't pretty. The sound dragged out of a tightened throat, warped and off-tempo, the voice of someone crying and singing at the same time, the voice of someone terrified enough to want to die, but singing because she didn't know what else to do, because singing was the only thing she knew, the only thing her mother had left her, and if she had to die tonight, she would die with her mother's song on her lips and Arthur's hand in hers. The attackers hesitated. 1 second. 2. Their orders were to take the old man alive. They knew about the girl, but they hadn't expected her to position herself so effectively as a human shield, making a clean shot at her impossible without risking a fatal bullet hitting Arthur, which would violate Harlan's strict orders to keep the old man breathing. Killing her wasn't part of the plan. Dragging her out would take time, and time, in this world, was measured in bullets. Their hesitation lasted 3 seconds, 3 seconds in which Maeve sang and shook and held Arthur's hand and believed she was about to die. The longest 3 seconds of her life, longer than the 20 minutes she'd been late to room 14B, longer than 13 years of survival, longer than everything. Then Beckett came. Not with footsteps. He moved quieter than the intruders, faster than shadow, and the first thing Maeve heard was gunfire. 2 shots. So close together they almost overlapped, clean and precise. A dry crack in a small room slamming off the walls, and the 2 dark figures in front of her went down, one collapsing instantly, the other staggering a single step, before crashing into the balcony glass exploding, crystal sound blooming, shards flying. And Maeve felt something hot and sharp slice into her right side, through pajama fabric, through skin, and the pain arrived a beat after the heat. But when it hit, it split her breath in half. She looked down. Blood. Dark red in moonlight, soaking into white cloth, spreading slowly, widening. A shapeless bloom that was cruelly beautiful, like a flower opening on her chest, red on white, just like the red apron over the white dress on the first night at the Meridian, just like the pool of Bordeaux bleeding across marble, the image repeating, the circle closing, blood and wine, real and false, the first night and maybe the last. Beckett reached her before she could fall. His hand, still holding the gun, smelling of hot gunpowder, caught her shoulder, and he shouted her name. Maeve. Not the voice of an order, not the voice of a kingpin, not the voice of any version of Beckett Rourke the world knew. This was the voice of a man who was afraid, truly afraid. The kind of fear money and power and an underground empire can't shield you from. The kind of fear he'd felt only once before, 22 years ago, when his sister lay on the cobblestone path. Her name was a plea on his tongue. Maeve looked at him, her vision blurring at the edges, pain clouding everything. But she forced herself to focus, because she had something more important than the wound, more important than the blood, more important than the pain biting into her side. Arthur remembers, she whispered, each word costing her, each breath pulling the cut wider. He remembers everything. Ask him. She swallowed, the taste of blood in her mouth, metal and salt. Ask him about Harlan. Beckett didn't waste time thinking. He shoved the gun into his waistband, bent down, slid one arm under Maeve's back, the other under her knees, and lifted her off the floor. She was so light he almost lost his balance because he'd braced for more weight. Light like someone who'd never had enough meals. Light like someone who'd spent her whole life making herself smaller to fit the tight spaces the world had assigned her. Maeve let out a thin moan when the cut along her ribs stretched, her head falling against his chest, copper-brown hair coming loose and sticking with blood, and he felt her breath warm and damp through his shirt, fast and shallow, the breath of someone trying not to pass out. With one arm holding her, the other brought the gun back out, and Beckett Rourke stepped into the dark hallway with a bleeding girl in his arms and a pistol ready to fire at anyone who got in the way. Tate was already at Arthur's room. The old man stood by the bed, awake, shaking, but not screaming, not panicking, his eyes bright with the frightening light of someone who had just remembered the truth and wasn't going to let anyone make him forget again. Tate gripped Arthur's arm and guided him into the hall, and the four of them moved through the darkness. Tate leading with Arthur, Beckett behind with Maeve. No flashlight, no talking, only breathing and footsteps on cold stone. Below them, the estate trembled, doors slammed, more glass shattered. Strange feet ran on the first floor, more intruders, and Beckett knew the first four had only been the opening wave. The side gate being opened meant every layer of security he'd built over 10 years had been neutralized from within. It meant the traitor wasn't some minor inside man, but someone who knew every code, every camera, every blind spot, and that thought burned through him, but he locked it down, because right now his father needed him alive, and the girl in his arms needed him steady. The service elevator sat at the end of a side corridor, a small lift meant for food trays and fresh sheets, just big enough for 4 people if they stood close. Tate had already pressed the button. The doors slid open. They rushed in. The doors shut. The elevator dropped through darkness, cables humming, and inside that tight space, Maeve could hear Beckett's heartbeat through his chest, fast but even. The heartbeat of someone trained to live inside danger, a heartbeat that didn't panic even while the world was collapsing. The lower level wasn't the basement she'd seen the night before, but deeper than that, the garage, gray concrete, and the smell of motor oil and 4 black vehicles lined along the wall. Tate yanked open a door, helped Arthur into the back seat, ran around to the driver's seat, started the engine, a low growl, and Beckett laid Maeve into the back seat on the other side, gently in a way that was softer than the way he set a gun on a table. Gentle enough it made her want to cry, because that hand that smelled of gunpowder, that hand that had killed 2 men less than 5 minutes ago, was lowering her head onto leather like he was setting down glass. He slid into the middle, shut the door, and Tate drove them through an automatic garage gate that opened into the night. The Rourke estate fell away in the rearview mirror, fire beginning to flicker in the first-floor windows, and Beckett didn't look back, didn't watch the house he'd grown up in burn, because something inside him was burning hotter. Maeve lay on her side with her head in his lap, and he pressed a towel against her ribs. A clean towel Tate kept in the car, white turning pink and then red almost immediately, and her blood was warm through the cloth, soaking into his fingers, and that warmth made him nauseous, because it meant she was losing blood. She was spilling out of his hands in the most literal way. And he, Beckett Rourke, who controlled the entire underworld of Chicago, couldn't control a few dozen milliliters of blood seeping through his fingers. He pressed harder. Maeve moaned, eyes closed, face paper pale in the darkness of the car, and he said, I know in a voice he didn't recognize as his own. A voice soft and low, a voice that should never exist in the mouth of a mafia boss. But it was there, it came out, and he couldn't stop it. N, the other side of the back seat. Arthur sat upright, eyes open, his hands gripping something Maeve couldn't see but could sense, because she recognized the smell. Old fabric, kitchen, cooking oil, a torn red apron, the apron she'd worn at the Meridian, an apron someone had washed and placed in her room, and Arthur had taken it when no one was watching, clenching it like evidence, like a rope tying him to reality, and he was speaking, not muttering a delirious loop. He was telling it, clearly, slowly, each word exact, his voice carrying the force of a man who had wrestled memory back from illness and wasn't going to let it be stolen again. Harlan sent the truck through the garden. Saturday afternoon, the lilies were blooming, the kids were playing. He knew. He ordered the truck through. Brianna ran onto the path. The truck couldn't brake in time. Arthur paused, pulled in a shaking breath, then went on, his voice breaking but not stopping. Harlan stood 30 meters away, watching. He watched her lying there. Then he erased the traces. bought witnesses, told me it was an accident, said it was an unknown truck, said nobody knew who the driver was. 22 years. He sat at my table for 22 years. Beckett listened. Every word his father spoke fell into him like acid onto steel, eating, burning, drilling through. His world collapsed for the second time in his life. The first time was when Brianna died and he was 15, standing in a hospital watching a white sheet pulled over a small body. And now, 22 years later, the 37-year-old mafia boss was sitting in a car fleeing his own burning home, hearing his father say the man he'd trusted most, the man he'd called uncle, the man who'd taught him how to hold a gun, how to negotiate, how to read faces, was the man who had killed his sister. Every shared meal, every glass raised, every late-night piece of advice, every pat on the shoulder when he killed for the first time and his hands shook too much to hold a cup of water. Every year like a son to me. All of it. Every moment. A coat of paint laid over the body of an 8-year-old child. Beckett's jaw locked hard. Hard enough Maeve could hear bone grind through her head resting on his thigh. And when she looked up, she saw his eyes in the car's darkness. Dry. No tears, but bloodshot, veins raised, the whites gone pink. The eyes of a man holding a storm inside by pure will, and that will was cracking. His right hand clenched the grab handle, knuckles bleached white, tendons standing out at his wrist. He wanted to kill. Maeve saw it as clearly as she saw the blood on her own clothes. He wanted to turn the car around, find Harlan, and kill him with his bare hands, slowly, second by second, and the desire coiled inside him like a constricting snake. But his left hand on Maeve's wound stayed gentle. It kept steady pressure. It kept the same careful force. It adjusted each time the car bounced. It shielded the cut from the draft slipping in through a cracked window. Violence and tenderness in the same man, in the same moment. A right hand ready to crush and a left hand keeping her alive. And that contradiction wasn't a contradiction at all. It was Beckett Rourke, whole and complete. Darkness and light braided together in a single heartbeat. The car tore through Chicago, streetlights smearing into yellow streaks across the windows. Then the lights thinned, the houses thinned, the road widened, and the city fell behind them like a dream fading out. Maeve lay in Beckett's lap, listening to his heartbeat through the bone of his leg, counting each beat to stay awake. And she knew she was losing blood, knew the world was blurring at the edges, knew that if she closed her eyes she might not open them again. But she wasn't as afraid of dying as she was of leaving Arthur alone, because he'd just remembered the truth, and if she wasn't here, who would hold his hand when the fog came back? Then the forest appeared. Pines on either side of the road stood black under a moonless night sky, the scent of resin slipping in through the crack in the window, clean and distant, the smell of a place without marble estates, without basements, without blood on the floor, and Maeve breathed it in, as deep as she could even with her ribs torn open, and thought that if this was her last breath, at least it didn't smell like gunpowder. The cabin appeared at 4 o'clock in the morning. After 2 hours of driving through Wisconsin woods on a dirt road, the GPS didn't know. A road only Tate and Beckett knew, because it existed outside every map, built with cash and silence, leading to the place Beckett had prepared for the day his world collapsed. A day he didn't know would come in what form, but had always known would come. The cabin was small. Pine wood, 1 story, 3 rooms, sitting in a clearing cut into old forest. No neighbors, no power lines, only a small generator and a well. And when Tate turned off the engine, the forest silence crashed in like cold water thrown in the face. Absolute silence. No sirens, no engines, no gunshots, only wind in the pines and the night insects, and the heavy breathing of Maeve lying across Beckett's lap, eyes closed, face wax white in the headlights. Tate carried Arthur into the back room and laid him on the bed, the old man gripping a torn scrap of red apron in his hand, eyes still open, still lucid, lips still moving as he repeated the story about Harlan, like someone afraid that if he stopped speaking, the memory would be swallowed again. But his 71-year-old body was spent, and he fell asleep mid-sentence, his hand still clutching the red cloth, his lined face tightening in restless sleep. Then Tate came back out and treated Maeve's injury on the old sofa in the main room under a yellow oil lamp, using the first aid kit Beckett had stocked in the cabin long ago. The cut along her side was long but not deep. The glass had sliced through the intercostal muscle, but hadn't entered the chest cavity, hadn't touched her lungs, hadn't touched any organs. Tate said, "You're lucky." And Maeve almost laughed because she'd never heard the word lucky applied to anything in her life. Tate stitched it, 6 stitches, numbing her with the medicine in the kit, wrapped it, and told her she needed rest, water, at least 2 days without moving much. Then Tate went outside to keep watch, and the cabin held only 3 people. Maeve didn't know when morning arrived because she drifted off after Tate finished bandaging her, drifting under pain and exhaustion. And when she opened her eyes, the light was different, gold and warm and soft, slipping through the small window, filtered by pine boughs, laying long golden fingers across the wood floor. Forest light, early light, the light of a place that wasn't marble and chandeliers. And in the first instant of waking, before the pain in her side could remind her that everything was real, Maeve thought she was dreaming. Then she turned her head and saw Beckett. He sat in a wooden chair beside the sofa where she lay, his back straight but his head slightly bowed. Dark circles deeper than she'd ever seen on him, rough stubble on his jaw, his shirt still stained with her blood. The dried color shifted from red to dark brown, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and on his thigh lay an unrolled strip of gauze, a roll of tape torn jagged, an opened bottle of water. He'd been there all night. She knew because the water bottle had been full when Tate left it, and now it was down by 2/3, which meant Beckett had poured water for her while she was out, had lifted her head and tipped the bottle to her lips, and waited patiently for her to swallow small sips in a half-awake haze she didn't remember. And the unrolled gauze meant he'd changed the dressing, meant the hand that knew the weight of a gun, that knew how to clamp down on Gerald's wrist until the man collapsed, that knew how to question a bound man in a basement, had tried to hold thin gauze and lay it over her wound without hurting her, and he'd torn the tape with his teeth because he couldn't find scissors. She could see the teeth marks at the end of the roll, and that small detail, teeth marks on tape, tightened her chest harder than the stitches. The roles had fully reversed. She'd spent a week caring for his father, pulling off his shoes, tucking in blankets, holding his hand through the night, playing piano for him, and now, in a small cabin in the Wisconsin woods, Beckett Rourke was learning how to care for her, learning clumsily, with half-unwrapped gauze, with tape ripped by teeth, with a water bottle poured a little too fast, with the choice to sit all night on a hard wooden chair without sleep, with presence, the one thing she'd taught him mattered, the one thing that required no money, no gun, no power, only being there. "You look terrible," Maeve said, her voice rough and low, each word tugging at the stitches in her side. But she said it because she needed him to know she was awake. She was alive. She was still herself, still blunt, still unafraid of offense. And something flickered in Beckett's face. Not much. The right corner of his mouth lifting by a couple of millimeters, maybe less. But Maeve saw it because she'd learned to read every muscle in that face across sleepless nights. And she knew what it was, almost a smile. Not quite, but the closest Beckett Rourke had come to smiling in 22 years. "You got stabbed and the first thing you do is critique my appearance," he said, his voice flat. But somewhere under that flatness was something warm and light and new. Maeve wanted to laugh, but her side refused, so she only closed her eyes for a second, let her mouth curve at the edges, then opened them again. He looked at her, and he said, 22 years, and his voice changed. The almost warmth vanished, replaced by something heavy and deep, the sound of stone grinding stone. For 22 years he sat at my dinner table, called my father brother, watched me grow up, taught me how to hold a gun, clapped my shoulder when I killed my first man, told me, "I'm proud of you, Beck," called me Beck, the name only Brianna used. He used that name, the name of the child he killed, to call me. And he knew, for 22 years, each word fell heavy and slow, like bricks dropping from a fortress wall, and Maeve watched his hand clenched on his thigh, knuckles white, tendons roped, force enough to crush a glass even though there was no glass, only his hand grinding itself. She reached out, slow, pain flashing in her side, but she did it, and laid her hand over that fist, light, not forcing, not pulling, only there, the way she'd placed her hands on piano keys, the way she'd placed her hand near Arthur's in the restaurant that first night, not gripping, only present. And Beckett released, finger by finger, slow, the little finger first, then the ring finger, then the middle, each one opening like a dried petal trying to unfurl, and his hand flattened, trembling slightly, resting under her palm, and he left it there, lowering his last weapon, and she closed her fingers around it. "I want to kill him," he whispered, and it wasn't a threat, It wasn't a plan. It was a cry. The cry of a 15-year-old boy standing in a hospital watching a white sheet pulled over his sister's face, just learning that his 22 years of mourning had been a joke in the hands of a traitor. "I know," Maeve said softly. Steady, not judging, not encouraging, not offering a hollow sermon about forgiveness or how violence solves nothing, because she didn't believe in hollow sermons, and she respected his rage, respected the right to want to kill of someone who had just lost everything for the second time. "But your father needs you alive. Not needs you to get revenge. Needs you alive. Truth. Simple. Nothing added." Beckett closed his eyes, inhaled, exhaled, and he didn't pull his hand away. Silence in the cabin, long and soft, only whined through pines and golden sunlight across wood planks. Then from the back room where Arthur slept, they both heard it. Tapping. Soft, steady, slow, fingers tapping on the wooden bed frame, keeping time. A familiar rhythm. The simple melody Maeve had played at the Meridian, played every morning in the living room. The song her mother had sung when Maeve was 8. The song Maeve had sung in the dark, while 2 men with guns stood in front of her. Arthur remembered that melody. He didn't need a piano. He didn't need Maeve at the keys. He only needed fingers and wood and rhythm, and the song lived inside him, not inside a delirious loop, but inside awareness, inside lucid memory, in a part of the mind the disease couldn't reach because it was guarded by something stronger than illness. Beckett opened his eyes, looked toward Arthur's door, then looked back at Maeve, and in his eyes, for the first time, Maeve saw something she'd thought had died in this man 22 years ago. Tears. One drop, left side, sliding down his cheek, slow, then falling from his chin and landing on the hand she had wrapped around his. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't turn his face. He didn't hide. For the first time, Beckett Rourke let someone watch him cry, and Maeve held his hand tighter, because in that moment she understood the circle had closed. Her mother's song had traveled from a tiny kitchen in a cheap apartment to room 14B, to a piano in a 5-star restaurant, to the mansion living room, to a dark bedroom under gunfire. And now it lived in the soft tapping of a 71-year-old man's fingers in a cabin in the Wisconsin woods. And it wouldn't die, because some songs don't need a singer. They find their way, they live on their own, they heal on their own. And this song had found the people who needed it most. Maeve woke fully when the sun was already high above the pines, warm gold pouring through the cabin window across the blanket, the wooden floor, and Beckett's face as he sat in the chair beside her, with the posture of a man who hadn't slept in 2 nights and refused to leave anyway. Her ribs hurt, her old arm ached, her whole body felt bruised. But she was alive, and that was the first thing she felt before the second thought arrived. Fast and cold, making her reach for the pocket of her sleep shirt on an instinct she couldn't control. Empty. She checked again. Empty. Her hand searched the other pocket. Empty. Searched under the pillow, under the blanket, between the folds of the sofa fabric. And every place she searched and didn't find it made her heart beat faster, faster, faster than it had when she stood in front of 2 men with guns last night. Because last night she'd been afraid to die, but now she was afraid to lose, and losing hurt more than dying. Miss Odell's embroidered handkerchief. She sat up, the torn ribs pulling a moan from her. But she didn't care. She dug through the sofa, the floor, every corner of the small room, and Beckett stood up, watched her, asked, "What are you looking for?" And she didn't answer because she was trying not to panic, trying to believe it was here, somewhere, only she hadn't found the right place yet. She found Tate, asked him. The small cloth, embroidered with lavender flowers. "In my pocket. Did you see it?" And Tate shook his head, guilt in his eyes, because he remembered that when he stitched her wound last night, he'd cut her shirt open and hadn't checked the pockets. She asked Beckett, and he didn't answer immediately. He watched her face, watched the panic rising in her eyes, the kind of panic he'd never seen in her. Not when she stood in front of a gun, not when she saw the basement, and he understood that what she was searching for mattered more than her own life, at least to her. "It might have fallen in the car," he said slowly, and she knew what that meant. The car had driven 2 hours through forest in the dark, her blood on the leather seat, and the handkerchief, if it had slipped from her pocket when Tate cut her shirt or when Beckett carried her into the car, was lying somewhere, stained with blood, maybe on the floorboard, maybe on the seat, maybe dropped outside when the door opened, left behind in the night, in the woods, on a road with no name. Gone. Maeve collapsed. Her knees hit the cabin floor. Her arms fell limp at her sides, and she cried. Not the kind of crying she'd done before, not the silent, controlled tears beside Arthur, not the held-back tears when she heard him call her Brianna, not the quiet crying in the darkness of her bedroom in the estate. This time she cried for real. Her shoulders shook hard, out of control, like someone being yanked off the earth. Her nose reddened, her mouth twisted, her breathing broke apart, inhaling with a sharp hiss, exhaling into rough sobs, ugly, loud, raw, the kind of crying she'd hidden all her life because she'd learned young that ugly crying didn't earn love. Crying had to be pretty, quiet, controlled, swallowed, but now she couldn't swallow it anymore because the handkerchief was gone, and the handkerchief was everything. To anyone watching from the outside, it was only an old cloth. Cotton softened almost to rot. The lavender stitching faded, the edges frayed, but to Maeve it was the only proof in the world that someone had ever loved her. Miss Odell, St. Catherine Shelter, the 57-year-old woman with silver hair, hands rough from washing clothes and cooking for 20 orphan children, who had watched 14-year-old Maeve walk through the shelter door with 12 stitches on her neck and dead eyes, and had said, "You're safe now," in a voice Maeve believed for the first time, believed with her whole body. Miss Odell had given her the handkerchief, had embroidered lavender, because lavender heals. Maeve, like you'll heal too. And Miss Odell had died 5 years ago. Cancer. Fast. And Maeve had made it in time this time, had held her hand when she went, and the handkerchief was all that remained, the one thing Maeve carried every day, slept with every night, and now it was gone. Beckett stood watching her break apart on the floor, and he didn't know what to say. He was a man who could command a city, buy anything, kill anyone, and he stood in front of a girl shattered on a cabin floor, and didn't know what to say because no order, no amount of money, no bullet could fix this. But he remembered. He remembered the first night, Arthur's room, Maeve on the cold floor with her back against the bed, her arm lifted so his father could hold her hand, saying nothing, only being there. She hadn't talked. She hadn't explained, or soothed, or searched for the right words. She'd only held a hand. So he did the same. He sat down on the floor beside her. His knee hit the wood and he heard his own bones complain, and he reached out and took her hand. Awkwardly, a little too much force, because he wasn't used to holding anyone's hand unless it was a threat, not used to softness. His fingers squeezing too tight, and then loosening too much, and then tightening again, searching for the right pressure and not finding it. But she didn't pull away. She only cried, clutched back, and cried into his shoulder. And he didn't even know when his shoulder had become a place for her to lean. No one counted how long it lasted. When it eased, when Maeve's breathing steadied, when her shoulders stopped shaking. They sat on the cabin floor with their backs against the sofa in silence, and the sun had climbed higher, warmer, more golden. Beckett helped her stand, slow, careful with her ribs, and the two of them stepped out onto the cabin porch. It was small, raw wood underfoot, no railing, looking out into a clearing among pine trees, and morning sun sifted through the branches in hundreds of golden threads, the air carrying the scent of resin and damp earth after dew, and that simple beauty felt almost cruel after a night of blood and guns and fear. Beckett stood beside her, looking at the forest, and said, "I lost everything last night." His voice was flat, but thin, thinner than Maeve had ever heard it. Maeve shook her head slowly. "No," she said, hoarse after crying, but steady. "You lost the house. You kept your father." Silence. Wind moved through the pines with a soft whispering, and she added, quieter, "And I lost Miss Odell's handkerchief." She paused, looked down at her own hand, thin, calloused, old scars, new stitches, dried blood under nails she hadn't washed clean yet. Then she smiled, sad and small. The smile of someone who had cried enough and was learning how to stand again. But she'd say, "You don't need the handkerchief, Maeve. You need people." Beckett looked down at his own hand. Big, thick knuckles, veins raised. A hand that had built an empire out of fear, held guns, crushed throats, signed orders to erase men, slammed tables in rage. The boss's hand, the destroyer's hand. Then he looked at Maeve's hand. Thin, calloused, scared, bandaged. A hand that had washed dishes for 12 years, held a dead mother's hand, held his father's hand through the night, played piano through tears, shielded an old man from a gun. A hand that didn't build empires. a hand that built a sanctuary out of presence. He laced his fingers through hers. On purpose. One finger at a time. Index first, then middle, then ring, then little. Weaving into her fingers. Tight, the right pressure. And this time he found it. Because this time he wasn't trying. He was only holding, and the ice inside him that had lasted 22 years cracked, not shattering at once the way films pretend, not melting in spring sunlight the way novels claim, but cracking slowly, painfully, bleeding, seeping drop by drop, and each drop was warmer than the one before, and the warmth hurt more than the cold, because it reminded him he was still alive, still able to feel, still had someone to hold on to. From inside the cabin came Arthur's voice. Beck, one word, the name only Brianna had used. The name Harlan had stolen and dirtied for 22 years. But now it came back, in his father's voice, in a cabin in the woods, clean, whole, as if truth had washed it. Beckett's eyes wet, the second time in 24 hours, the second time in 22 years. He stood, still holding Maeve's hand, lifted her gently, and the two of them walked back into the cabin, into the golden light through the glass, into the room where Arthur sat on the bed, eyes clear, his hand still gripping the red apron scrap, and when he saw his son enter with the girl who played music, he smiled, thin and trembling, but real. And Beckett looked at that smile and understood that this was the garden, not the garden where Brianna died. A new garden, a place where lilies could grow again without being crushed, a place where Maeve's mother's song could exist without a piano, a place where Arthur could say, Beck, without Brianna, a place where Beckett could hold someone's hand without needing a reason. He looked at Maeve. She looked at him. And in the early cabin sunlight in the Wisconsin woods, among grief and loss and dried blood and tears not yet dry, they saw the same thing. Redemption. Not grand, not dramatic. Only two hands woven together, an old man smiling, and a song no one needed to sing because it was already living in the tapping rhythm on the bed frame, in memory, in love. This story isn't about a mafia boss saving a girl, or a girl saving a mafia boss. This story is about presence. About how sometimes the greatest healing isn't money, or power, or medicine, but simply having someone sit beside you on a cold kitchen floor at 3 a.m. and say, I'm still here. About how each of us carries scars. Each of us has our own room, 14B. Each of us has a lily garden where pain is buried. And sometimes what we need isn't someone to fix us, but someone willing to stay when the whole world runs. If this story touched you, if it made you think of someone you want to hold, if it reminded you of someone you were 20 minutes late for or someone you still have time for, please hit the like button to support the channel in bringing more healing stories like this. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story at the right time can change a day, even a life. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe now so you won't miss what comes next, where light is always found in the darkest places. We want to hear you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been Maeve, 20 minutes late and living with that regret every day? Or Beckett, building walls because you're afraid of being hurt again? Or Arthur, trying to find your way home through fog and needing someone to hold your hand? Share your story, what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. In the comments below, we read every line and value every word. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and always someone to hold your hand when you need it most. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.